Colleagues, we're ready to roll. The sound checks have been done with those who... Yes, yeah.
Could we clarify, is the minister able to stay? It's 4:45 now, so we've lost 15 minutes. Is he able to stay in that 15?
Yeah, he's nodding, yeah. Yes. So the sound checks have been done. Everything is good. For the benefit of the witnesses and the interpreters, for the benefit of the interpreters, I would say to the witnesses, please, we have to be careful about noise levels that could harm the interpreter's hearing. So please do not hit the stem of the microphone when you are not speaking. Please turn off your mic, and if you're not using your earpiece, please put the earpiece on that round sticker that looks like a coaster that in front of you. So we're very pleased today to welcome the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. I believe, Minister, you have a 10-minute opening statement. Is that correct? Well, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues, j'aimerais commencer par vous remercier.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for allowing me to appear to speak to the boreal caribou situation in Quebec. This is an important species for nature. Can you hear the interpreter? Check, check, check to make sure the interpreter is coming across.
Yeah, it's working. It's working,
yeah. The boreal caribou is very important to the nature. The ecosystem of this boreal caribou is degrading. We've understood for a long time that this is an important ecosystem, not only for the health of the caribou, but also for our water, our air, our climate, and our economy.
Because this is so important, I will be repeating this in both official languages. Boreal caribou are an indicator species for the overall health of the boreal forest. Their decline is considered to be the canary in the mine, an indication that the boreal forest ecosystem is degrading. It has long been understood that this ecosystem is important not only to the health of caribou, but for our air, water, climate, and our economy. La richesse naturelle québécoise et canadienne est ancrée dans notre culture.
The nature of Quebec and Canada is part and parcel of our nature, and we all benefit from the benefits and the services that they provide. Every day, these services are clean air that allows us to offset heat waves and to filter water, which in Quebec we call blue gold as well, and they capture carbon and support all kinds of economies, biomass, pulp and paper. But all of this cannot be taken for granted. It behooves all of us to ensure the health of all of our ecosystems so that we continue to benefit from the wealth and all of this that the nature provides us. As you know, Canada received the entire world in 2022 for COP15. Thanks to Canada's leadership and our allies, a new world framework for biodiversity has been adopted. The Quebec government, in fact, signed this and has committed to contribute to world goals to protect at least 30% of our earth and oceans by 2030 and to halt the decline of biodiversity. Often, Quebec is being cited for its social and environmental leadership, that is carbon pricing and its climate approach, and for stimulating an open economy to electrifying transportation and all kinds of other services. Unfortunately, some of these successes are also part of a failure that is not recent, and it's thanks to this that the federal government launched a process to develop a protection order which affects 3 types of caribou in Quebec which are facing imminent threat.
Boreal caribou were listed as threatened species under the Species at Risk Act in 2003. Caribou populations trends indicate that the species is declining across Canada. In Quebec, for example, the majority of 10 populations are in decline. In 2023, the Quebec government estimated that the provincial population is fewer than 7,400 individuals, a marked decrease over the past 10 years. 2 of those populations, Val-d'Or and Charlevoix, are now maintained in year-round pens with populations of 9 and 39 caribou, respectively. The population in Pipouacan declined by 24% between 2012 and 2020. Without urgent action, there's a high risk that all these populations will no longer exist in the wild. And without an adequate plan, that they are fated to stay in pens for the rest of their lives. That is not acceptable. Nous négocions avec le gouvernement du Québec depuis 2016.
We've been negotiating since 2016 with the government of Quebec. We are prepared to share costs with respect to reestablishing the caribou. So as part of our conservation efforts and agreements that have been signed with other provinces. In 2022, we believe that we found a solution with the clear commitment by the Quebec government to table a strategy on the restoration of the caribou by June 2023, which will specifically include how we would protect at least 65% of the caribou's habitat. And it was at the beginning of our deliberations in parallel with the Independent Commission of Quebec on the caribou, which has confirmed that this species has been declining in Quebec, that the provincial government must do more as quickly as possible in order to protect and to restore the habitat of the species. After a decision of the Governor and Council last year to foster a collaborative approach, one that we've always preferred, we waited for the Quebec's government strategy, which unfortunately never arrived. Following many requests, our department undertook a scientific current assessment which identifies that the boreal caribou is losing habitat. A vigorous assessment is based on the most rigorous data and clearly shows that the boreal caribou in Quebec are facing many imminent threats. So as part of this evaluation on 10 June 2024, I've indicated that this caribou is facing imminent threats. So legally, I must, under the Endangered Species Act, to recommend to the government in council to issue an emergency order for boreal caribou protection. In June 2024, Canada indicated that they would move ahead with this and it would protect the 3 populations of the boreal caribou that are threatened. Our government has adopted a regional and balanced approach on the issue. The purpose is to protect the best possible habitat available to the caribou all the way as much as possible, limiting socioeconomic impacts. Our government does not take this emergency order lightly, and I'm certain that the preceding Conservative government did not take lightly the decision taken in 2013 to implement an emergency order in the prairies for another species. So assuring the survival and restoration of caribous is a shared jurisdiction and must include Indigenous communities, municipalities, industry, unions, and civil society. And this can only have a successful outcome if the province is a willing partner, because it holds the main responsibility for managing its wildlife. We have invited the government of Quebec to take part in the consultations, but the province has refused to date. In addition, it has not provided data to support the socioeconomic study. Throughout the process, we have been open to the government of Quebec to find a collaborative solution. Personally speaking, I still hope that we will be able to find a balanced approach with the Quebec government, which has regulatory and legislative tools available that are of the greatest flexibility with respect to this matter. In 2024, Quebec then tabled a number of limited measures for 3 pilot projects, 1 on the boreal caribou. However, these proposed measures have not clearly been defined, and there will be a consultation nevertheless, and the schedule has not yet been set. If Quebec takes sufficient action, the implementation of the federal decree may not be necessary. However, in the face of the threat to caribou, in the absence of an adequate strategy on the part of Quebec, we have a legal and moral responsibility to intervene. I'd be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. I would like to emphasize that the Minister is accompanied by 2 representatives from his minister, Ms. Tara Shannon, Assistant Deputy Minister, Biodiversity and Canadian Wildlife Services, as well as Derek Hamanitz, Director General, Economic Analysis Directorate. I do believe that it's Mr. Martel who will start us off. Thank you, Chair. Minister, are you aware that your order is going to create a social and job crisis? Well, as I said in my remarks, we adopted a similar approach as the Conservative government did in 2013 for an emergency order. I'm sorry, but how many jobs will be lost? How many jobs will be lost due to this order? It is what I was trying to say as I answered your question. We have just completed the consultation with all of the stakeholders on the social economic issues as well with respect to the protection of the caribou. Mr. Martel? Well, I was asking for an answer. I want to know how many jobs will be killed due to this order. The minister has heard the question. I would ask that we give him an opportunity to respond. Minister, please go ahead. Thank you, Chair. We are currently analyzing, and that's what we'll be doing next few weeks, all of the briefs and testimony that was submitted as part of the consultations in order to develop the order. The order has not yet been developed. That is what we'll be doing over the next few weeks. So you're asking me to answer a question, whereas we're still currently developing this order. Minister, I'm simply trying to know how many jobs will be cut due to your order. Your department conducted the analysis, but the department says at the minimum there are 1,400 jobs that will be lost. Some $900 million of economic impacts. So what is your response to that? That is 1,400 jobs at the minimum, thanks to your order. As you know, this analysis is based on preliminary data since the final order has not yet been adopted. These are estimates. It may greatly vary depending on the final order. Minister, what are you going to say to these people? That's 1,400 jobs that will be lost. What will you tell these people who have families, who have houses in their communities, who are going to be losing their jobs? What are they to do afterwards? That is, you will endanger these communities. What is your response to them? Well, as you know, I come from a small city in Quebec, which is called La Tuque, which has been living from a forestry for a long time. There's a pulp and paper plant, and there are sawmills. I understand this reality very well. And this really upsets me that your party has absolutely no understanding of the adequation between the state of a forest and the state of an industry such as the forest sector, because we haven't taken care of our forests in the city of La Tuque. We have several hundred jobs left in the plant. Why is that? Because the state of the forest has deteriorated. Minister, I've met with the workers. I met with the companies. They're extremely worried. They do not know what is going to happen tomorrow. These are jobs. They're very happy to stay in their communities. They bought houses. They don't know if they're going to have to move tomorrow. They don't know what they're going to do. So what I want to know is this: do you have a plan for these workers? Because if your order is tabled, then jobs will be used. I have also met with the workers. I met with unions. I went to La Tuque 2 weeks ago. I was in the Lac Saint-Jean region as well. I went to Chibougamau. I sat down and I met with representatives from the companies as well. There is something that could ensure that the federal order does not go forward. That is, if the provincial government, the Quebec government, tables what it was supposed to table. If they do that, then we don't have to need to move ahead. I don't know why you're always speaking about Quebec. What has Canada, what have the Liberals done since 2015? What have you done for the forest sector? What exactly have you done? The lumber agreement has not yet been settled, and we've been speaking about it for years. I've been here for 6 years, and every time we're speaking about the lumber agreement. So what have you done for the workers and the forest companies today to ensure their prosperity? What have you done? Chair, I thought that I was here to testify about caribou. I think that we're moving away from the subject. If my colleague could cite some data. Mr. Martel, a moment, please. Please continue. If Mr. Martel would like to obtain further information as to what other departments have done for the forest sector, we can certainly provide that information to the committee. I'm Minister of the Environment. I'm not Minister of Economic Development. Yes, there has been research conducted in my own writing on the forest sector and the new forest products available. They recently received a subsidy, but Mr. Martel, please go ahead. So there will be a serious impact that will derive from your order. The workers are worried. What are you going to tell to Eric, Jean-Marc, to Mathieu, and the Girard, Tremblay families who work in the forest sector? What are you going to say to them if they lose their jobs due to your order? What are you going to say to them? You no doubt know that all of the experts, the unions, indigenous communities, and environmentalists, the workers say that the very future of their sector is tied to the health of the forest. The Conservative Party does not seem to grasp that. All other stakeholders understand that. You cannot have a sustainable forest sector if the state of our forest continues to deteriorate. You're the only ones who don't understand this. Well, what are you going to do with these 1,400 jobs that will be lost at the very minimum? What will you do with these people? Are human beings taken into account in this? What do you do to them? The mayor of the city, have you met with her, of the community, when she says that her village will no doubt become a ghost town? What are you going to say to her? Mr. Martel? It's a social economic impact. Yes, of course we're aware. Mr. Longfield, it is
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Chair, and
Thank you.
And thank you, Minister, for being here. I'm going to ask my questions in English, mais vous parlez à moi en français si tu veux. I know this is a Quebec issue, but it's also a national issue and an international issue. And in your opening statement, you opened with our international agreements that have been signed, the Sustainable Development Goals being some of those agreements that we signed in 2015 with 193 different countries. Given your legal obligations under the Species at Risk Act, it wasn't your decision, was it, to propose the emergency order?
So the way that the Species at Risk, and thank you for the question, Mr. Longfield, the way that the Species at Risk Act works is if the experts from Environment and Climate Change Canada come to the conclusion that a province is not doing enough work to protect the habitat of a species that is endangered, then once this determination has been made, I have a legal obligation to make a recommendation to the cabinet for an emergency order. Then cabinet can decide whether or not they want to move ahead with it or not. Last year in 2023, I made a similar recommendation to cabinet, and at that time, they basically cabinet asked me if I could try and negotiate with the government of Quebec, which we've tried to do for over a year. Unfortunately, those discussions and those negotiations were unsuccessful. Which is why I had to go back to cabinet to ask again for an emergency order, which was granted this time. So it's a cabinet decision. It's not an environment minister decision. It's a cabinet decision.
Thank you. And so, so that I'm clear, if Quebec had taken sufficient measures, you wouldn't have to be asking for this measure to be taken.
Merci. Et je vais quand même répondre en français. Je pense que c'est important.
I will answer in French. I think it is important. I am still convinced that we will be able to come to an agreement if the Quebec government is ready to contribute. Quebec, in an open letter, agreed with us that by the end of 2022, we would be presenting a plan to restore the caribou, and that goes back to 2016 after all. And they said by June 2023, we will submit this plan. This will explain how we will protect at least 60% of the habitat. These were the words of the Quebec government. But in 2024, in September, this is where we are at, and we still don't have that plan in hand. If the Quebec government were to decide to move forward with the plan as it had committed to do, it will be my pleasure to go back to the Governor and Council and say we no longer need to move ahead with the emergency order.
Thank you. That was the next question on my mind. So it's a temporary order. It's in place only for as long as it needs to be in place. but we do have legal commitments that we have to make or that we have to uphold.
Vous avez raison. Et pourquoi je dis que je suis
You're
optimiste?
correct. And why am I saying that I'm optimistic that we'll find an agreement with Quebec? We were able to agree with Ontario on caribou. We were able to agree with Alberta on the caribou. We've been able to agree with British Columbia regarding the caribou. I do not see why, if we were able to come to an agreement with all of these provinces, it's not possible to find common ground with the Quebec government on the issue.
Okay. So it isn't a matter of politics, it's a matter of legalities. And from my understanding then, and you're nodding agreement, as we look at sustainable development goals, and SDG 15, I believe, is on this one of land, of living beings on land. But sustainable development goals also include economic sustainability, they include environmental sustainability, and they include social sustainability. So including the jobs and the support of transition, that all of the sustainable goals line up with the three pillars of sustainability, which 193 countries have agreed to. And it seems to me that's not as much of the conversation as it potentially should be, that when the countries got together at the United Nations, 193 signed on to how are we as a planet going to approach sustainability. The caribou fall into this discussion, but so do the workers. Could you expand on that just a bit for the committee, please?
Yes, absolutely. And we publish an annual report on how we're moving forward on the implementation of our Sustainable Development Goals in Canada. And what you said was reinforced by the Montreal Kunming Agreement in 2022, the Kunming-Montreal Agreement on biodiversity, where 193 countries, and as I said in my introductory remarks, the government of Quebec agreed together that in order for sectors like forestry and others to be sustainable, we need to protect at least 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030. So that, and that's something you've heard workers here, union representative, say that they understand that the future of the sector is not based on short-term profits. It's based on long-term sustainability of the forest, so that there's long-term sustainability of the forestry sector.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Chair.
We'll go to Madame Posey.
Et je laisse mon temps de parole à mon collègue
I will cede the floor to my colleague, Mario Simard. Thank you, Minister, for being here tonight. As you know, the forest sector is a chain. If you cut part of the chain, this has a negative impact on all of the forest sector. And when I analyzed the data, which were provided to me, in fact, when I looked at the report developed by your department, I see that this has a disproportionate effect on the forestry sector. You need to take into account the general economic situation. Over the last 4 years, the forest sector has had to fight firefighters, and that's a considerable shortfall for everybody. There are epidemics, there's infestation. We also have the borer. And there is a lack of financial assistance by the federal government and tariffs that are far too high. If you put this together, if you move forward with the order, I can guarantee you that you're going to completely cause upheaval in the forestry sector. And I'm saying that because most of the small communities in the Lac Saint-Jean, in the North Shore, basically live from the forest. In the report that you tabled, there is a mention of the loss of 1,400 jobs that will be endangered by the order. And if you factor in the indirect jobs, quite truthfully, that would be a catastrophe, Minister. I understand that you want to pressure Quebec. I agree with you. I think it's important to find a means of protecting the caribou. But if you move forward with this, I can guarantee you that you're going to completely destroy the structure of many communities in the Lac Saint-Jean. They are going to starve, and I'm not saying that lightly. They're going to starve. And I'm not convinced that you're going to be successful in saving the caribou. Why? Because in the forestry sector, you can listen to biologists of the wildlife that are defending the caribou, but look at the entire ecosystem. If you take out the workers, there's no longer any reorganization. There are some more resilient species, so they resist fire. We have some that are less resilient because they're more vulnerable to infestations. And I think that's important. I believe that the best possible solution for you, and I know that you've said that Quebec is delaying its response, but the best thing for you would be to step back, perhaps to start a conversation with Quebec and the various stakeholders in order to find a solution that will enable you to both save the caribou and especially to maintain these jobs. Because ever since I arrived here in 2019, I've never seen a positive action taken on behalf of the forestry sector by your government. So if I were able to deliver the testimony that I've witnessed it from the various stakeholders in the forestry sector, it's really a cry of desperation. So I understand what you are trying to achieve, and I think that's commendable, but I think the negative effects far outweigh the positive effects.
Thank you for the question or comment. Excuse me, concerning what my will, it's a legal obligation I have as Minister of the Environment. It's not something that I get up one morning and decide, depending what side of the bed I get up on, I'll have an emergency order or not. It doesn't work like that. There's a legal obligation to make this recommendation to Cabinet, and then Cabinet will decide what are the next steps to take. So Cabinet has decided we should move forward with an order. It's not something we take lightly, but I would nevertheless like to, as you're probably aware, last year we signed an agreement with British Columbia, an overall nature agreement, including protection of a number of species, where the federal government invested about $500 million and the province invested a similar sum. So we're not asking the provinces to reach conservation objectives on species and put that burden on their shoulders without helping them out in various types of programs that may indeed be directed toward forestry workers. Mr. Guilbeault, if you don't mind, you have a legal obligation to take action. We also have obligations to answer our targets that we set for the reduction of greenhouse gases. And I see inconsistencies, millions of them. You've given $34 billion to buy a pipeline. The most ambitious plan of the federal government for the energy transition is $40 billion for one hydrocarbon project, $34 billion. The most ambitious project in your history to fight against climate change and the energy transition, $40 billion. It's inconsistent, but I know you can live with it because politics means that sometimes you have to make compromises. What I'm asking you today is to make a compromise that will make it so that many little communities in Quebec, including Latuc, where you come from, will be able to continue to subsist on the forestry sector and continue to contribute to building low carbon housing using wood and contribute to replacing products that have a considerable carbon footprint. So through the bioeconomy, if you go ahead with that order, all of those aspects will be endangered. The very conservative analysis, and it's not an insult if I say that, I'm sorry, that you produced would be such that you would be putting 55 businesses on the block, and those are in small, devitalized communities, those businesses. I understand you have an obligation to bring this forward, but I don't think the government is right down to a single compromise. I think that I'll want to listen to Quebec and work together for a solution. Mr. Simard, we have now reached. No, but not really, because I understand, but he may answer in a different context. So let's move ahead to Mr. Boulris, please. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here today for this important study. We're in the Environment Committee, so I'll talk about the environment. You've talked about a lot of things in your introductory comments, important things, biodiversity and climate change, but a little non-exhaustive list here. We talked about an assessment under the Liberal government. Canada has the worst results in the G7 on reducing greenhouse gases, and we're the worst in the G20. And when the UN asked us to tax excessive profits in the oil and gas sector, the lobbyists from those companies went to the office of the finance minister and affected you in last budget. We still don't have any reduction in emissions for the gas and oil sector. The Commissioner of the Environment is alerting us that we can't rely on your plan for reducing greenhouse gases for large corporations. There are a lot of loopholes in your plan, so the companies like Suncor will pay 1/14 of the price of coal compared to the average worker or family. And as my colleague said, your government paid $34 billion for a pipeline that is so useless that even the private sector did not want to take the risk of buying it and enlarging it. So we want to save the woodland caribou. But if we save the woodland caribou and the planet burns and the forest around the caribou burns, what result will that give us? Thank you for the question. So first of all, there are a number of things that you mentioned which, with all due respect, are erroneous. Since 2019 and 2022 have the best greenhouse gas reduction of all the G7 countries. We are the only country in the G20 that eliminated subsidies, such as some of those countries. They agreed in 2019 in Pittsburgh to do that. No other country of the G20 has done it. And we committed to go even further by taking the commitment to reduce what we call public financing of government-run corporations or the BDC. No other G20 country has made that commitment. It still hasn't been completed. We said we're going to do it this year. It would have been faster if we could continue to work with you. It'll be a bit slower, but no one else has done it. We're the only ones. No one else in the world has made the commitment in the G20 to do this. As regards our plan, the Climate Institute, an independent organization, in particular noted that at the pace things are going, we'll reach our objective by 2026, in the first time in the history of the country, and our greenhouse gas reductions were so low. O.J. Simpson was in a trial, and the iPhone was invented but not marketed yet. So our emissions have never been at such a low level since then, 25 years ago. So of course, we have to work on conservation. This is why we went, in terms of maritime and ocean conservation, from 1% in 2015 to 16%, headed toward 30% for 2030. So we're at about 15% for land conservation. So I'm the first to recognize that we need to do more. We need to do more because what you did that is more is the biggest subsidy to an oil company, the Trans Mountain purchase of $34 billion of public money, of the taxpayers' money. And the tax credit you give for carbon capture for a technology that doesn't work, that isn't proven, is also a huge subsidy. So when you say that we eliminated all the subsidies to the oil companies, it's not true. You keep doing it directly or indirectly with terrible loopholes on the production of those companies and without any ceiling on emissions. So the Liberals have been, Mr. Bullrich, we're supposed to be talking about caribou today. Well, I'd like to talk about the forest and when the forest burns. Well, let's go back to the forest, please. Coming back to the forest then, if the fact that the Quebec government is dragging its feet and the caribou is at risk, and we don't want to see it disappear, the fact that you are perhaps going to be forced eventually to issue an order that is not a notice of failure per se, you would have been able to agree with the Quebec government. As I said earlier, we were able to agree with a number of provincial governments on the issue of caribou. So I continue to keep hoping that we'll be able to agree. Some talk about the order as a radical order or something like that. You heard Mr. Martin Saint-Laurent, full professor on animal ecology at the University du Québec at Rimouski, who said that the order looks more like a compromise than a radical protection strategy, despite the widespread consensus on the evidence. People are making a lot of effort to provide disinformation and denial of the science in the media, contributing to social polarization observed under this issue. So I think that if we had more people working toward finding a solution, if fewer people trying to continue to increase the negative side of things, we'd make more progress. You have 45 seconds left. Very well. If we ever had to come out with an order to save a species that is threatened, endangered, I'm very sensitive to the alarm cries coming from the communities and unites people, but if they disappear, the caribou, we won't be able to bring them back. What consultation and discussions do you have with Indigenous communities for whom caribou is an important symbol and a large part of their identity and way of life? 15 seconds. We don't have much time left, but I could share with the committee a number of meetings and briefs that were filed with the forestry industry, with the mining industry, and the tourism industry, and the municipalities, and workers and First Nations. There have been hundreds of meetings. We met hundreds of people. Thank you. Thank you. We will now move on to the second turn, and is Mr. Paul Hus, who will open this second round. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Minister, and both of you. Minister, you talked about radical earlier. We are the ones who clearly stated that your order, the way it was brought forward, it was described as radical because we calculate that there's no balance in the approach that you took. You decided to impose an order that will endanger dozens of businesses and thousands of jobs. On that, I'd like to know the status of discussions you had with the leader of the Bloc Québécois, because we know there was a good relationship between the two parties. But what discussion did you have with Mr. Blanchet concerning the caribou issue? Well, first of all, I greatly disagree with your description of the order. It is not more radical than the one that the Conservative Party of Stephen Harper brought forward in 2013 on a different species. It was the same procedure. Your approach is radical, but I'd like to know what discussion you had with Mr. Blanchet. If my approach is radical, then I think many people will smile because the Conservative Party of Canada is radical in the environment. I'm not sure that they'll go there. I'm talking about your relationship with Mr. Blanchet. What did you discuss with him on the order? I had a discussion with the leader of the Bloc Québécois in June, if I remember correctly, on the phone. It lasted a few minutes. Did you negotiate an arrangement? No. So the letter is signed with the members of your party in the Bloc Québécois. How were you able to sign a common letter addressed to the committee? I beg your pardon? One person at a time, please. I think the question was asked. Mr. Minister, I'm not sure I understood the question. We were talking about caribou, and there were requests for meetings because of the party, and the Bloc didn't answer. And at one point, there was a letter sent to the committee from Liberal and Bloc MPs. So what negotiation took place to lead to that letter? Well, you asked me what negotiation I had with the leader of the Bloc Québécois, and my answer is that I didn't have any negotiation. I had one discussion with the leader of the Bloc Québécois asking for clarifications when the order was announced last June. I did not speak to the leader of the Bloc Québécois in July nor in August on that. So as regards the order, it's been more than a year and a half now that we've been saying it's a radical approach. The Bloc Québécois was not part of that scene, and then after the summer holidays, we started putting pressure on you. On your side, you consider today that, the Bloc Québécois decided not to support our non-confidence motion. Was there a discussion with you? Because one of the conditions of the Bloc Québécois was to halt the order. Was a request made to you to halt the order? Well, once again, I repeat that if that order is radical, then the one that the Conservatives adopted in 2013 should also be described as radical. It's the same approach that we used. And if you have any questions for the Bloc Québécois, I encourage you to ask them. Listen, let's stay on track. Questions and answers for now between Mr. Paul Hus and the Minister. And we can discuss other matters perhaps during the break. I don't know where we are. The Minister was answering. Is that it? Is that where we stand? I think the question, I'm trying to answer the question, did I have any negotiations with the leader of the Bloc Québécois on this question? My answer is and was and will remain the same. No, I did not negotiate with the leader of the Bloc Québécois on this issue. Thank you. Earlier in your answers to other colleagues here, you mentioned at the beginning that you had no justification or concern. You are concerned by economic impacts. After that, you said, I do take into account economic impacts, but you clearly stated it's not my problem. I'm in the environment, and it's the Ministry of Industry that takes care of environmental impacts. That's not what I said. I would like to know when you presented your proposed order to the cabinet, did your colleagues from industry and your colleagues from finance ask any questions on the economic impact of this order? Because it seems to come from you, but you mentioned earlier that the cabinet approved it. So if the cabinet approved it, there must be some ministers dealing with economy who questioned the impact. If they didn't ask any questions, then there's a heck of a problem with cabinet, isn't there? No, everything you just said is pretty well false. First of all, I did not say that I was not concerned about socioeconomic impacts. I clarified that we did a socioeconomic analysis and that we would continue to do a socioeconomic analysis. And I said, I'm not Minister of Innovation and Economic Development. And if you want to get information on the subsidies that were provided by that department, we can certainly provide that. If you would let me answer, Mr. Paulus, I can answer your question. Of course, I cannot speak regarding discussions in cabinet. As you're probably aware, those discussions are secret, but there is a socioeconomic analysis of potential impacts that is presented during those discussions. Thank you, Ms. Chatel. I would like to thank the Minister for being with us today. We heard a lot of testimony in this committee, and it's true that there is a lot of concern, but the cry from the heart from workers was really concerning the state of health of the boreal forest, because for the workers, they think about their jobs today, but they also think about the long-lasting jobs, especially in rural areas. And I know I have rural communities in the forestry industries, so there's really a lot of concern among workers and also on the part of industry to ensure that the forest will be at peace. So we talk a lot about caribou, but when you said that it's a canary in the mine shaft, what do you mean by that? What does that indicate for the state of health of the boreal forest? What I mean by that, and you're quite right, perhaps just briefly, you are quite correct. I had a number of discussions with the workers in person when I was in Chibougamau and virtually also more recently. And in contrast to the Conservative Party of Canada, those people understand that the future of their jobs and the future of the sector relies on the health of the forest and that one cannot go ahead without the other. The caribou is a species which is like a barometer. So if that species is doing well, then we can suppose, of course you have to do the studies, but you can suppose that the ecosystems are well off. And it should be clarified, this will answer in part what Mr. Simard was saying earlier. We succeeded in resettling caribou in Canada, or reestablishing caribou in agreements with the provinces and with Indigenous people, I should specify. We've done that. We're able to do it, and everyone should sit at the table and try to find a solution. And right now, there are a lot of people at the table, but not the Quebec government. And I'd like the Quebec government to sit at the table with us and all the other stakeholders to find a solution. And this is precisely the cry from the heart of all the stakeholders, whether it's the forestry industry, workers, environmental groups, to sit down together because there are solutions. The workers proposed some solutions, but they all agree that the boreal forest needs to be given some love now. And in that context, can you explain to us the status of the consultations and also the socioeconomic considerations that we discussed? You said that you heard some stakeholders. So what are the socioeconomic considerations in this order? Perhaps I'll let Derek answer that specifically to give you more accurate information on the socioeconomic aspect, or perhaps Tara could. But regarding the consultations, I'll give you a few numbers just briefly. But from the forestry industry and the unions, it's more than 400 people that participated in the consultations, the mining industry and the workers in that sector, some 60 people, and 30-odd people from the tourism sector, 26 from municipalities, 105 from other sectors in the region, 200 individuals from the First Nations that were consulted, collegial groups and experts. 59 people were consulted. So we could provide to you the list of the representatives of the various municipalities, RCMs, companies or associations or unions that were met with. But at the request, in particular, of two indigenous communities, we extended the consultation period by 1 month. So we did consultations that were substantial, and your colleague from the bloc said, you cannot wait, because the solution will not be to wait. It's been 8 years that we've been waiting. At one point, can we say that you're not serious? There's someone at the table that is not serious. It's been going on for 8 years that we've been waiting, and we're not the only ones. You heard a number of experts say that this order is not radical, but it is a compromise. This is something that even in certain cases, some people would say we should have done this a long time ago. It's not as if we didn't give the Quebec government a chance several times to come to the table and propose solutions. And unfortunately, so far, they have not done so. What steps after the consultation? You said that the order was not finalized. Indeed, we need to analyze all the testimonies that were given and the briefs that were filed in the consultations. And then after that, the experts of the department will prepare the drafting of the order that will have to be presented to the governing council. Thank you, Ms. Posey. You have 2.5 minutes or 150 seconds. Thank you, Chair. So listen, we indeed describe the order as radical and perhaps not balanced, because there's a Mr. Branchot who came to testify in August here in the committee on this file, and he said it takes 200 individuals to have a chance of survival. But you're making an order for 9 individual specimens, from 9 to 200. Well, I'll ask you a question on another theme, the mines. There was an article in Le Devoir. I even brought it with me, an article where they talked about the Nova project in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And this refers to probe gold. The government will be prepared to exclude the zone to enable probe gold to set up shop, and the company acknowledges, as was reported in Le Devoir on September 13th, that the activity would involve a lot of activities in natural areas, including disruption or disturbance of some components of the area, change in the course of waterways, loss of wetlands. Any industrial complex will be placed in the essential habitat for the Val d'Or caribou. But this is an observation from your department. So sure, there will be an environmental assessment done, but it remains that the government could authorize this project, whatever conclusions come from the environmental assessment, and it's written in quotes, if the public interest justifies those effects. So it seems to me that there's an imbalance there. The gold mine, well, that's not my thing, but then with regard to the forestry sector. So here they're going to allow considerable disruption of the caribou population, whereas they're excluded from the order. 30 seconds, Mr. Guilbeault. First of all, I'd like to quote Mr. Branchot, who, before this committee, said the emergency order proposed by the Canadian government is justified and measured. So that's what Mr. Branchot, you quoted him. This is what he thinks about the order. I don't have the article you referred to in front of me. We can certainly get back to you on that. But as you know, we have an impact assessment process that is very rigorous. And I have followed, well, we decided when we reformed Bill C-69 that we were going to depoliticize impact assessments and give it to experts. And I listened to the experts from the Impact Assessment Agency each time that they made a recommendation after many consultations and studies. And if we recommend something also, we'll go forward. And if it's negative, then I listen to them in one way or the other. Thank you, Mr. Bouzaris. Thank you, Chair. Regarding the delays, the fact that it's been dragging on for 8 years, I was a bit surprised to hear colleagues from the bloc say that perhaps we still need to wait a little. I would like to know from your viewpoint, from the viewpoint of your department, how much longer can we wait? Well, actually, the emergency order is a way for us to say that we can no longer wait and that we need to have measures brought in measures that have been promised, that were promised repeatedly, and that have still not been not only implemented, but even announced in some cases, because what Quebec presented to us, as you've heard from a number of experts, I don't want to repeat what they said, but it was well below what is necessary. The next steps, what is the schedule for the next steps? As I explained to colleague Ms. Chatel, we need to compile and evaluate all the testimony that was given in the consultations and draft per se, do some drafting. There's no order yet. We have to draft it, and it has to be approved by the governor and council. We're still talking about a few months to finalize the process. I don't have an exact schedule. One of the impacts that is disruptive to woodland caribou is the increasing number of roads, and one of the impacts is more easy access for predators. We heard people from the Conservative Party say that to save the woodland caribou, we need to kill wolves. In your opinion, is that a viable solution? As you probably know, in Quebec, there are 500,000 kilometers of forest roads. You can go around the road with 20,000 kilometers and change. So I think it could certainly be an area of intervention to close off some of those roads, to reforest them, not all of them, of course, and there's some that are used for recreation and tourism. Let's assess it. But in Quebec, we need 500,000 kilometers of forestry roads. And the solution proposed by the Conservative Party is to eliminate predators. That is not a solution that is viable or desirable either. A little comment, 10 seconds. You have enough time? Thank you, Chair. You're welcome. You're very welcome. Mr. Martel. So as you may have noted, I'm quite emotional when I talk about workers because I met with them. I went into the region and there's distress you can see in their eyes. They love the forest. They love their work. They are people who right now are very anxious or troubled and they don't know what's going to happen. Minister, I would like to know, have you met with the mayor of Sacré-Cœur? Did you go to see her? Well, you're talking to me about the workers. I met with them a number of times again recently. I have had meetings with union workers from a number of companies and sectors of the forestry. I did not meet with the mayor. That was my question. But the mayor stated something that I consider very important, and I'm from the region. The forestry sector for that region is huge. And the mayor very clearly stated that if you impose the order, it's going to make a ghost town of Sacré-Cœur. And I would say, my gosh, the minister, I cannot believe that he's insensitive to that and that he didn't go to meet with her. What could you tell that woman? The mayor was completely speechless. She couldn't understand for the workers or what you could say to that mayor. It's curious because that's not the message that the workers gave me when I met with them. The workers, Minister, what workers did you meet? Did you meet the workers from Waisaco? We met workers from a number of companies in Chibougamau. I met some there. I met some in Lac-Saint-Jean and others virtually also. And those people understand that the future of their jobs and the future of the forestry sector depends on the health of the forest. What you and your colleagues in the Conservative Party seem not to understand or not to want to understand, I'm not sure which exactly. Minister, you're talking about the impacts of the order, although it's not written yet. We've done a preliminary analysis on a certain basis that is preliminary. But I know that you like fear campaigns. That's your house brand. I understand that. But the reality is that we are taking into account all the impacts, including the socioeconomic impacts of the decision we make. It's an obligation, Minister. Here we're talking about the order, okay? You're not able to guarantee to us that the population, with your order, that the population of the caribou will increase or that you'll be able to save them when we know that your order is going to kill off jobs. That we're sure of. We're certain that it will kill jobs. And on the other hand, you are not able to guarantee to me that the caribou population will increase. But to me, it's senseless. It doesn't make sense. Those people who you said that bought homes, that are going to lose their jobs, and they only do that, and those it's generation to generation. I said to myself, the minister cannot be insensitive to that. Of course not. What I'm really surprised by is that you and your party, whether it's on the issue of caribou and conservation and the impact on with plastic pollution and climate change, you play the ostrich. So you say you have no solutions. Let's sacrifice the caribou. You have the condition that forests can go down. We don't care. Mr. Guilbeault, that's not true. And before I pass on the microphone, you cannot guarantee then that if you impose your order, that the caribou population will increase or that you'll save them. You cannot guarantee that. Are you able to guarantee that? I said earlier to your colleague that we were able in Canada to restore caribou populations by working together. We can do that, and we have done it in the past in the country. I'll pass on the microphone. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. Minister Guilbeault, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the carbon tax. Will you remove the carbon tax from home heating for all Canadians this winter?
Vous faites erreur, j'ai parlé de la tarification.
You're mistaken. I talked about carbon payments in Quebec, which uses a form of cap and trade, which is different from the federal system. I was talking about the provincial system. I can certainly reread the passage.
It was really delayed, so I didn't even hear the first part of it.
Okay. I'll give you a few more seconds, but I also, again, like I said to Mr. Boulris, I mean, we're really here to talk about the caribou, not the price on carbon. I know
Sure.
you can link it somehow, but go ahead. Go ahead.
You mentioned it. I just want a simple answer. Will you remove home heating carbon tax from home heating bills this winter for all Canadians? All Canadians.
Donc, vous avez fait référence à...
So you referred to my speech, and in my speech, I mentioned the Quebec government. We often congratulate them for their environmental leadership, including the carbon fees, but we're talking about the Quebec government's cap and trade system that is completely different from what is done elsewhere in the country. Thank you, Ms. Chatel. Thank you, Chair. Listen, I don't know where my Conservative colleagues were during all the sessions of the Committee on Caribou, but we heard the unions and their call from the heart. Take care of the health of the forest. You're talking about jobs, my gosh. They were there, and they said to you, what were the solutions for the health of the workers, of their jobs, and their future in the rural areas in forestry? It really relies on health, and they raised certain solutions, but that my Conservative colleagues completely ignored. But it has to do with rethinking the forest in such a way as to include a number of options to develop the forestry industry. One of the solutions was to do more instead of, as we said, instead of going case by case like in the US, is to do processing. I know it's not your portfolio, but were there any discussions on that with the forestry industry? Well, it's mostly my colleague, the Minister of Innovation, and other cabinet colleagues who have those discussions. But when I was in Chibougamau, I visited the Chantier Chibougamau plant, and it's worthwhile for the committee to go visit that. Each piece of wood that enters the plant, there's a 3D scan to maximize what can be cut from the log, and then they make stadiums and bridges with that. There's a lot of innovation being done in that company. And I think that it is this kind of innovation which is the future of Quebec's forests and probably elsewhere in the country too. So there is a great deal being done in the forest, and you're quite right. The Conservatives are, so to speak, concerned about the outcome for workers when there's an election campaign, but when the workers come to the committee, they ignore what they say. It's as though there was nothing. As though they didn't say anything, and the workers only have the same message as Mr. Martel. You heard them. That's not at all what happened, and that was not at all the position of the workers. It's quite shocking when they do politics on the backs of workers when the workers and their unions come to the committee to tell them what are the solutions, and they completely ignore them. I'm really stunned by that. What are the measures that could be brought in the short term in order to minimize perhaps the impacts of an eventual order? We don't have the details of an eventual order, but if the province does not commit to doing a plan, if the province makes a serious plan to protect caribou, which all the stakeholders have requested, so if there's another call from the heart, Quebec really ought to be a partner in this, in the solutions. But we have to move toward, if we have to move toward an order, what analyses do you do to reduce as much as possible the socioeconomic impact and the impact on the sector of forestry in Quebec? I gave the example to your colleague, Mr. Simard of the Bloc earlier. In an agreement we signed with British Columbia, the federal government will invest close to $500 million in the coming years, with the province also investing a similar amount in very similar issues. We already have an agreement with BC on caribou, but for example, on protecting old growth forests, creation of other protected areas, on measures to assist workers that could be impacted in certain sectors. So we're ready to have those conversations and to see what federal leverage could be used. We're ready to make investments of hundreds of millions of dollars in Quebec in order to help both in biodiversity and on jobs as well. And once again, the Quebec government has to sit down at the table with us so that we can have those conversations, as we did with a number of other provinces in the country. You talked about workers, but also the forestry industry. I have 2 forestry companies in my area, and they're ready to get on board with more processing, with innovation. So could they benefit as well from those investments in rethinking the forest? For that type of investment, it's a lot more on the side of Mr. Champagne in the innovation and economic development, but we have certain measures in reforestation and things like that that we work on with natural resources. But as regards technology and innovation, industrial innovation, it's more in the portfolio of the Minister of Innovation and Economic Development. Thank you. So that concludes the first hour. Minister, I believe that you have to leave now, but that the representative of the department who accompanied you today may remain for an additional hour. And I announced that in addition to Ms. Shannon and Mr. Hermanutz, we have Marie-Josée Couture, Acting Director General, Canada Wildlife Services, and Nicolas Winfield, Director General, Canadian Wildlife Service. So if I could ask Ms. Couture and Mr. Winfield to come to the table, we'll continue with no interruption. So this brings us to, well, actually, because there is no interruption, we're not going to start back with a 6-minute turn. We're going to start with the 5-minute turns and 2.5 minutes. So now it's Mr. Martel, I believe, who wishes to question another witness. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Martel. Shall we get started? Yes, go ahead. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for having made the trip to come and be with us. Thank you. I'm not sure who could answer this. I could put my questions out there and you can, she can answer. I don't know, or you can decide. I don't know who. Listen, what I would like to know is that okay? Okay, fine. It won't be long. I didn't realize that it takes a bit of time for the witnesses to get hooked up as required.
Can we redo this?
Right? C'est correct? Je sais pas.
Ça va?
Ça va?
All
Est-ce
right,
que
is that, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Martin. All right, well, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to be with us in person. We appreciate it. I want to know, now the order that's being proposed, does it guarantee at 100% that the three populations of caribou will be reestablished?
Je peux commencer et
I can start, and I will be answering in English if that's okay.
The order cannot guarantee an outcome. However, it is our experience with existing orders that the populations of this targeted species have not declined, and in, I think, most cases have actually improved in terms of outcomes. So I'm talking about not just, there are not orders, this would be the first order that would respect boreal caribou, but we do have orders in place respecting other species, the sage grouse in the prairies and western chorus frog in 2 locations in Quebec. I can ask if my colleague Nicholas Winfield would like to add any precision to that, if you'd like.
Sure. So it is the first step towards the recovery of the species. It is not the only step that is required to guarantee the recovery of the population. Thank you.
est-ce que vous êtes conscient que le principe...
Now, are you aware that the glass, the principle of the glass bell, you know, if we're talking about climate change, you know, it's 26 degrees outside today in the rural areas or in the regions. Now, caribou preferences for where to feed. What do you think of that? Are you aware that the principle of the glass bell does not respond to all the caribou, all that threatens the caribou?
So I'll start my response by noting that in the first instance, I'll go back to the imminent threat assessment that we completed, which is science-based. Now, the focus of that threat assessment is on anthropogenic impacts on the species. So it doesn't address all impacts. So yes, we are aware that there are other impacts, other factors that are impacting species. I'll turn to Nicholas again to add if there's anything that he would like to add from his perspective.
Yeah, so I don't know this term that you use, the cloche vert, but I assume that you mean that putting a glass cover on this and then assuming that you can resolve all the issues within the cover is the issue. So each of these populations occupies a range, historical range, a geographical area that it has existed in. And the scientific assessment has all been around what is required to recover those populations within their historical range, taking into account human disturbance. So there are habitat variables, the loss of habitat, there are predator variables at play, and the reproductive success. So all of those things were taken into account in assessing the impacts on the population, and the proposal to advance an emergency order is one step towards recovering the population, but it is not the only measure that is required for their recovery.
Moi, je viens de région. Hein?
Listen, I'm from a region, Saguenay, Lac-Saint-Jean, and I'd be curious to know, do the analysts, have they, you know, do they know that in my riding, we are already cutting all the wood that has been granted
and that there's been other domino effects. So has that been taken into consideration?
I can try to answer that question. So the three areas where the order is being considered are areas where the level of disturbance is greater than the minimum required for the survival of the population. And the disturbance rates are going up. So the trend in terms of the ability for these species to recover is a declining trend. And it is based on the disturbance levels within those areas.
Okay, thank you. We have to stop there because that's more than 5 minutes. We'll go now to Mr. Ali. It's you? Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize. Okay, Mr. Vancouver. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the officials for joining us today. I had some questions regarding our obligations, but before I get to those, I just wanted to ask about the inevitability of the further decline of caribou populations if the status quo and work as usual, business as usual was permitted to just continue without any oversight, changes, or innovations. Because the question was posed, is this a guarantee that populations will increase? And I think we all know, there's no guarantees in this type of work, but there's obligations that we must do from a legal perspective, and then there's also really good science, which we must follow in order to achieve these ambitions. So my question is, what will the status quo achieve?
I'll start, and I'll ask my colleagues to add if they would like. Simply put, the status quo, so no action to protect the caribou would result in their further decline. With respect to the herds that are in pens, if there are no actions that would protect habitat that could be used in future, what we predict is that there would be no further existence in the wild of those herds.
Thank you. Now, my next questions, my original questions were with respect to our legal obligations, our obligations as being signatories for various commitments for preserving, conserving biodiversity. And it's my understanding that the province of Quebec has signed similar obligations. They're signatories to all of the same agreements, which are international. Could you inform the committee whether you feel as though this is optional, whether this is a choice for both the provincial government of Quebec and the federal government of Canada, or if we have an obligation as signatories to these international agreements to preserve and conserve biodiversity to stand up for species who are at risk and endangered, who can't cast ballots and lobby the government.
So Canada is a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the government of Quebec plays a very active role in the context of that convention on behalf of local governments. Both Canada and the government of Quebec have endorsed, signed on, it's not signing, it was an endorsement of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Includes a number of goals and targets, and target 4 of that framework is to the halt and reverse of species decline. It's not necessarily a hard legal obligation. It is a moral obligation and a commitment that both Canada and Quebec made in the context of that Global Biodiversity Framework.
But if an individual or organization or government is to sign on to those types of agreements and then not follow through with commitments and actions, is it a question of morality or is it a question of integrity and standing up for, doing as we say we're going to do?
Sure. Yeah. So I should indicate, so in the context of that, the framework, we are obligated, Canada, to deposit with the United Nations every year a report on our progress vis-a-vis those targets. And so, yeah, we would be called into question by the convention if we were to not make progress towards those targets.
With any remaining time, I'd have a question about sustainable forestry. Would any of you four be prepared to talk about sustainable forestry? I know that we're talking about caribou here, but Canadians need lumber, Canadians need an economy, Canadians need jobs. So it's reasonable to say, okay, we also need a forestry sector. We've had people on the committee in the last couple of meetings talking about truly sustainable forestry. Is there any insight that we can provide on other jurisdictions who have taken actions to ensure that their forestry sector is not leading to the inevitable decline of species at risk, and what we can learn from some of them?
I don't think that the four of us at this table are well placed to respond to forest practices. What we can say is that we do work closely with our colleagues at the Canadian Forest Service when we are approaching issues with respect to species at
thank
risk.
you. Thanks very much. We'll have to stop there and go to Mme. Posey.
Oui, j'ai 5 minutes, Monsieur le Président.
I have 5 minutes, is that right? 2.5 minutes. Oh. Yeah, because we're continuing. This is a third turn, or third round, if you will. Oh, okay. Well, I had lots of questions, but I don't have a lot of time to ask them. So earlier I asked the minister, and you were there, I asked him about the Novadar project. And now when they tabled their project, the forest caribou were already identified as a threatened species. Why did you let this program go ahead if you knew right from the start that Novadar would be setting up in the essential habitat of one of the herds?
I'm unable to speak to the specific project that you're referring to, and we would not have had any role in approvals of the environmental assessment.
Une autre question. Par rapport, tantôt on a parlé.
Here's another question. We talked about the control of predators earlier, and it seemed to be not a good. But some researchers and some studies say that the government of BC and Manitoba did incorporate similar measures, and when they're rigorously applied and twinned with a targeted restoration strategy, that it creates results. So do you have any opinions on that type of approach?
I'll respond briefly, and then I'll ask Nicholas to add. I think predator control is one avenue. It is one of the tools. It's not the only tool. The closure of roads, the rehabilitation of roads is also very important because they fragment the caribou habitat. And when the caribou habitat is fragmented, then they do worse. So I'll ask Nicholas to add.
Non, ça va aller. Je voudrais. Oui, je comprends.
No, that's okay. And I understand that predator control, contrary to what was said, but that it's one strategy and that it worked well in BC. So now there's an article that we found yesterday. In 2022, the federal government signed an agreement with the government of Ontario for the conservation of caribou in a context where the Ontario government abolished environmental protection measures. It ignored the federal requirements for threatened species to proceed with its own forestry projects that were not sustainable. But there were no protective measures that were significant to protect the habitat. So now, is this a double standard? That we're trying to impose something on Quebec that wasn't applied in Ontario? All right, you're at 3 minutes, but maybe the speakers could speak when they answer the next question. Mr. Bouleris, please. That's an excellent question that Ms. Posey just asked. I'd like to hear the answer, actually. All right, perfect.
Thank you for the question related to what's happening in Ontario. We did sign an agreement with Ontario 2 years ago to work with them to find solutions with respect to the way in which they manage the boreal forest, recognizing that there are similar issues in Ontario with respect to declining populations. The commitment is to find a way to ensure that there is a balanced approach to conserving boreal caribou and sustaining forestry. I'm not suggesting that the current state is acceptable, but we've acknowledged that the changes and the advancement of policies and procedures in Quebec, in Ontario, is needed, and they've acknowledged this also.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Il y a beaucoup été dit que,
So it's been said often that for boreal caribou, that you need a mature and an old forest, that's very important for their survival and maybe their return to growth even. But I think we're destroying mature forests, and then we're trying to re-tree those forests. But when these new trees grow in, it's not necessarily a real forest. So what is your vision? What are your projects to create a forest habitat that meets the needs of caribou, especially in terms of mature forests?
Thank you for your question. And you are correct that all scientific evidence suggests that boreal caribou are dependent on mature forests and connected landscapes that allow them to escape from predators, access food supply, etc. The recovery strategy calls for greater than 65% undisturbed habitat to ensure 60% likelihood of survival. So everything that we do in negotiating with provinces on range planning is to look at ways to manage a forest to ensure that there is a constant supply of older age forests and connectivity between those forests. So you're correct in your understanding of the issue, and many provinces and their experts are developing their forest plans to achieve that goal.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Mr. Leslie now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pick up on that last note. It seems like we're taking a hurry up and wait approach in many ways. And I understand that the minister said that there is a definitive need to act, but we seem to be imposing what is going to take decades to have any action. We talk about road closures, we talk about reforestation. That will not happen overnight. These are remote areas. We are not planting semi-mature trees. So this is a very long process that we are enduring. And in the preliminary socioeconomic analysis that the department produced, it says that the incremental benefits of an order cannot be assessed due to uncertainty with respect to how an emergency order would increase the probability of recovering the species. Now, Minister Guilbeault falsely said that maternal penning and wolf predation reductions don't work, and I appreciate that CWF has clarified that it does in fact work. Perhaps a fair criticism that it is not the long-term solution, that we still may need to undertake efforts like this. But looking at the science of what was a peer-reviewed article by one of our previous presenters from Ecological Applications shows that the best way for annual instantaneous rate of increase is penning and wolf reduction. So my question to the department, to CWF, why would you take an approach that you know or you don't know is going to work, that you know if it will work is going to take a very long time, when if we are at such an emergency decree situation that we could take action that is more immediate, that will be more effective, that will buy us time to take on these more important longer term solutions?
I think that Quebec has already acknowledged the situation, and therefore they put the animals in pens in the first place. We have supported through funding the penning of those animals in order to guarantee at least their survival in the short term. And Quebec is managing those populations with a vision that those populations will increase through captive breeding and then will be released into the wild. The issue is that there is no habitat for them to go to. And so the actions that are proposed now are to ensure that there is habitat for them to go to. And you're absolutely correct that the balanced approach between predator control, wildlife management through penning and through captive breeding, complemented by having habitat to return to, is the solution. But you are also correct that it will take time. And in every other jurisdiction, range planning is about establishing multi-decadal solutions to ensure that there is enough habitat for these animals to return to and survive.
What level of confidence do you have that this will be in any way successful if you have three options? You have do nothing, emergency order, and destroy a bunch of industries and a bunch of jobs and a bunch of communities in Quebec, or you take an approach to buy time and then work with the appropriate jurisdiction, the provincial government, to develop a robust plan to actually achieve this. Out of those three, which would be the fastest approach in your view?
Do nothing approach will result in their extirpation. The emergency order is seeking to ensure that there is habitat for them to go to. And the third option is the one that we would like to do, which is to negotiate with Quebec. But in terms of speed, we need a partner to negotiate with in order to have success on the recovery.
What is the best case timeline scenario for a successful increase in population with only this emergency order in place?
Okay, so there are 3 populations. There are 9 animals in captivity in one location. There are 35 in another, and the numbers are decreasing in Pipmoakan to the point where the actual number for them to be sustainable is 200. We are trying to ensure that there is an option for those animals in Pipmoakan which are still in the wild to have sufficient population numbers to be self-sustaining.
I understand that, but how long will it take? Like, you close the road, you're trying to reforest. What is the timeline for that?
In the case of Pipmoakan, it is about halting a decline. In the case of Charlevoix and Val d'Or, it is about creating a future state that will take 40, 50, 60 years for there to be sufficient habitat for the animals to return to.
So what happens if the predators kill them all in the next 40, 50, 60 years?
Then there will be no more animals left.
So why wouldn't you take an action that actually prevents that from happening?
They're in a pen.
I don't understand that.
They're in a pen.
An impenetrable pen?
No, they're in a pen and they're protected against predators.
Okay.
As a measure of last resort. So they are already in an emergency precarious situation.
Has there ever been any penetrations of that pen? Because I know in the BC example, they actually have riflemen go around the outside of their maternal penning nets on the First Nation doing it there. Has there ever been any instance where that's failed?
Maybe a quick answer to that. Has there been penetration of the pen?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Mr. Chatel.
Well, it's been clear since the beginning that the caribou, right now, to ensure that they don't disappear, they're in a pen, and the goal is to restore their environment. But anyways, so the questions that I have, we talked a lot about the importance, and the witnesses told us this. We have to immediately come up with solutions. We have to work with all levels of government. Everybody has to work together to find a solution. And this was a heartfelt cry from the witnesses. We have to rethink forestry to ensure its survival because we're dependent on it. Our homes, our families, our children, and their future in our regions depend on the jobs in forestry, in the forest rather. And if the forest is not healthy, and this is the disappearance of the caribou is a sign of that. So this is a cry for help and a heartfelt cry. So can you tell us, what is the history of your engagement with the Quebec? This is a key partner. Quebec absolutely has to be at the table, and you have to find solutions together. So can you give us, a background or a history of your work with Quebec? I'm going to let Marie-Josée answer that question. Thank you for the question. So yes, we have been working with the government of Quebec. There are 2 agreements with the Quebec government, one in 2018 and one in 2019 that lasted till 2022. And those agreements, those involved activities that were undertaken by the Quebec government in support of the caribou. And we were waiting for the strategy to be developed. So there were lots of activities that got funding from the Government of Canada. All right, so you've already there's already been a negotiation and collaboration agreements with Quebec. And so where are things at now with respect to those discussions, those agreements with your counterparts in Quebec? So as the minister mentioned earlier, we started discussions in 2022 to get to a new agreement. And those discussions were suspended or the negotiations rather, were suspended while we were waiting for Quebec to develop a strategy. But the discussions among officials continued. But there were no negotiations because we were expecting the strategy to come, and because that's a key part of future actions. Okay, well, and then the committee, we felt, we sensed the worry from people in their communities, with regard to their future and their jobs. We heard a lot of anxiety about ensuring that governments, ensure the survival of the forest. But do you have a calendar or a schedule that you could, and where are we in that process? What are the next steps? And when will the decisions be made?
So the consultation period closed formally on last Sunday, I believe that was the 15th. We need to undertake an analysis of all of the input, and as the minister had walked through previously, there has been a lot of input across all sectors, and so we will be preparing a what we heard report. And as the minister indicated, the development of an order itself takes some time. We're talking about months. We don't have an exact timeline at the moment. I can just say that it's not. This is a process of months.
Well, and say that Quebec were to arrive with a solution and a plan during that interim period, the order could be withdrawn?
If the Quebec government comes with a plan, the decree may not go ahead. I think that's the question. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you. On procède à un deuxième tour de 5
So
minutes.
we will start a second round of 5 minutes. And Mr. Mazur, you begin this round.
Mr. Hermans, on May 10th, Minister Guilbeault recommended that an emergency order be made. Is this correct? Yes or no?
I'll defer to my colleagues.
Ms. Shannon?
I don't have the timeline in front of me at the moment, but yes, in the month of May, the minister did make a finding that there was an imminent threat facing the boreal caribou in Quebec.
The emergency order was made. Okay, thank you. On June 19th, the Liberal government announced it would move forward with an emergency order. Is this correct? Yes or no?
There was a notification published on June 19th that the government was proceeding with a regulatory process, yes.
Yeah, emergency order consultation. Yeah. Okay. Mr. Hermans, is the government considering prohibiting road construction through this emergency order?
I'll defer to my colleagues. Yeah.
The issue of roads and their closure of roads would be one thing that would be under consideration in the context of the development of an order. The order has not been developed. Yeah.
It is being considered.
Roads. It could be one of the things considered, yes.
So you're considering prohibiting road construction through this order. Okay. Is this government considering prohibiting the expansion of existing roads through this emergency order? Yes or no?
Perhaps I'll just, Mr. Chair, I'll indicate that the issue of roads with respect to caribou would be the subject of consideration of an order. All aspects of roads in the context of habitat, critical habitat for boreal caribou. Again, these are issues that would need to be determined and defined through the development of an actual emergency order.
So they are considering prohibiting road construction through this emergency order? Yes.
The order has not been developed yet.
They are considering.
It would be something that would be subject of consideration in the context of the critical habitat for boreal caribou.
Okay, I'll pass it off to Mr. Leslie.
Thank you. How much time, Mr. Chair?
2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with Mr. Hermanitz. In the analysis, it states that the emergency, or if the emergency order goes ahead, there would be 10 mining projects shut down at a cost of $20 to $45 million. Did you calculate what a job loss would be associated with that, too?
On the mining side, I
Yeah,
don't have
page
those
10.
numbers in front of me, but I think the analysis suggests that those are projects that are at risk and are part of the analysis. It doesn't say that those projects will necessarily be shut down.
I understand that. So in your analysis, it concludes about 1,400 direct forest sector jobs could vanish if Minister Guilbeault's radical order is enacted, which is a little bit lower than many industry experts, but still a very substantial number. Could you describe for us what you think the impacts on the communities where those 1,400 people would be if this order was enacted as per the modeling that you've done?
I can start with the analysis that, oh, is my mic on? Yeah, I can start with the analysis that we've done, and that was with the Canadian Forest Service. And according to NRCan, Canadian Forest Service, approximately 1,400 direct forest sector jobs may be at risk. So again, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily, this is our best analysis at the time.
Well, but is there a chance it's actually much more?
Well, we do look, that's direct jobs. We do look at indirect jobs, and there could be 800 at risk we have in the analysis.
So that's the maximum. You think 2,200, if you enact this, no chance there's more than 2,200 jobs that are destroyed by this?
No, there's obviously uncertainty around
There's a chance it's
it
much
could be
higher.
higher, it could be lower. Like it's in the middle of our range. I would stress, as the minister said, this is very preliminary analysis, and we're looking forward to the results of the consultations.
Oh, in the continued analysis, in it you discussed that the radical emergency order could lower Canada's reputation as a reliable mining destination, which we've already seen plummet due to the overregulation under this most recent Liberal government's decisions. What dollar value would you put on the reputational damage that could be done if we take this approach?
I think first that's a comment that comes from our NRCan experts on the mining sector. And I don't think you can quantify that in dollar terms.
About 10 seconds. You have about 10 seconds.
Between ECCC and NRCan, do you think you have a full grasp on the potential ramifications of this decision if enacted?
I think we have, at the macro level, we do. We're looking forward to getting more information from the consultations on like individual mills and communities.
Madame Chatel.
Ms. Chatel.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, we were talking about the risks, reputational risks. In Europe, they are developing standards for the purchase of forestry products and wood that are in line with our COP15 commitments and protecting the biodiversity. International forums have been talking about this. And if we don't protect our endangered species, what could be the reputational cost for Canada of not only exporting of exporting our forestry products?
I don't know that it's something that I can quantify. I think what I could say is we have had reach outs from international organizations that are looking at such certification to express their concern and to see they are very much interested in the status of boreal caribou, not just in Quebec, but across Canada.
Mm-hmm. Just pour mentionner à mes collègues.
So just to let my colleagues, my conservative colleagues know that there is an economic price to our exports if we don't protect our biodiversity. Our products won't be bought. It won't be possible to export them anymore. So what is good for the environment is good for the economy as well. That's, we have to understand that. Now, we were talking about other jurisdictions and what's done elsewhere, but here in Canada, are there other jurisdictions that don't protect their caribou sufficiently with respect to the Species at Risk Act?
Every other province in Canada has signed a Section 11 agreement under the Species at Risk Act. to advance conservation measures within their jurisdiction. And with those agreements, the federal government is providing funding to support the actions around range planning and other measures required for their conservation. Similarly, Environment Canada is working with Indigenous groups, Indigenous communities to support their role in conserving and sustaining boreal caribou populations.
Merci. Puis,
Thank you.
j'aimerais vraiment retourner au
I'd like to come back to the consultations that you conducted. We've had some here, and you've probably followed the testimonies that were given here. Now, and this is going to be a challenge maybe, but do you see emerging, and I've seen this, maybe not among the committee members, but among the witnesses themselves, I saw a consensus emerge. When you were negotiating, and you're consulting rather, do you see as a consensus forming among people?
I'll ask Marie-Josée to respond on the question of consultations. She's been leading much of those. What I would say is it's clear that everyone agrees that there's an issue with respect to boreal caribou, that there is a desire to balance environment and economy. So I think, yeah, at a macro level, I think there's a lot of agreement.
En fait, Tara a raison.
So Tara is right. And maybe, in the same vein, everybody agrees that everybody has to sit down together as well. That has come out as well, often. That's another theme and another solution that's been proposed. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do I still have more time? 30 seconds. Okay, well, in 30 seconds then. So we did feel the urgency, but we also felt that this order was an alarm, and and this, especially among workers who live off forestry and in that sector, and those who represent them, the mayor who came to speak to us, for example, there was a desire to have a much more in-depth discussion. This is an urgent situation. We have to deal with it, but we have to talk and rethink together what the forest means. Have you felt that? Okay, we won't really have a time for her to answer that, though. So yes or no? Do you feel a desire? All right. Sorry. Otherwise, we're going to go late. Ms. Posey, please. Mr. Winfield, you were talking about the agreements earlier, and I want to come back to that. And this may be more of an editorial statement, but I want to come back to the idea that, for years, Ontario had abolished its environmental protection measures, and then they ignored the requirements of the federal government so that they could develop their own forestry industry. And when you signed that agreement in 2022, there were no significant protective measures to protect the caribou habitat. So I think it's a double standard. But I'm going to move on to my next question, and it has to do with socioeconomics with regard to so orders cost in the millions of dollars, that you're estimating losses in the millions of dollars for the forestry, and $20 to $45 million in the mining sector. So since the economic impact is much less than for the mining sector than it is for the forestry sector, so this is not bad only for the caribou, but it's also destructive for the environment. So why are you exempting the mining sector? Now, you say the order, it hasn't been written yet, but I feel like we need a more balanced approach that takes all the factors into consideration. But I feel like we're punishing the forestry sector, and we're favoring the mining sector.
Thank you for the question. In the consultations, we have discussed what could be exempted from the order, not what will be, but simply an approach for how to tackle the balance between biodiversity gains or conservation gains and economic losses. There is a difference in terms of the scale of landscape level change between forestry operations and mining. Both of them need to be managed effectively to protect caribou, but one of the differences relates to the physical footprint and the size of the impact. And in the context of forestry, it does tend to have a larger footprint on forests and therefore on caribou habitat than mining. But in both cases, they need to be managed sustainably. So your point is taken. Thank you. And my colleague can answer on the socioeconomic.
Oui.
Excusez, le temps est écoulé, là.
I'm afraid that time is up. Mr. Boulris, no, it was 2.5 minutes. It's a round of 2.5 minutes. And sometimes Mr. Boulris enables the witnesses to ask Ms. Posey's questions. That's very nice of him, but it's up to him. He makes that choice. Mr. Winfield, earlier you said that it's important to have a maximum 65% non-disturbance rate to enable a survival rate of 60%. I want to make sure I follow, because if we reach that level, we still have 40% chance of a non-survival.
In the recovery strategy that was prepared in 2012, there was a scientific correlation between the disturbance level and the recruitment of calves, of the reproductive rate. And in that document, given the concern around impacts to forestry and impacts to other landscape level, there was a policy decision to acknowledge that the relationship still resulted in only a 60% probability of success. So it is the recognizing the impact of these policies on forestry. The very document written in 2012 already took a risk-based approach in order to minimize socioeconomic impacts.
Mais ça reste quand même, je suis assez surpris de voir que...
I'm quite surprised to hear that 40% of non-survival is there. It's tremendous. That's 1 out of 2 chances.
Success. So,
dans les exemptions dont on entend parler,
in the exemptions that we've heard about, which no doubt are assessed by you as part of this emergency order, often we hear that mining projects would not be taken into account, and earth or rare metals projects either, or we've heard about wind projects and renewable energy programs. If everything is an exception, what is left at the end?
A quick answer to that.
well, this is going to be the subject of the evidence that we've gathered through consultations to determine what is possible, what can be exempted, what cannot be exempted.
Okay, Mr. Martel.
Alors, au sujet du décret, là, je sais bien que c'est...
With respect to the order, I know that earlier I had put the questions, but from the order I've understood this. There's no guarantee. You said that this is a first step. My question is this. If the order does not work, what will you do?
Monsieur Nicolas, si vous voulez.
Mr. Nicholas, please.
We will only know in the future. I can't predict what will we do in the future. So first of all, we don't have an order in place now. If there is an order in place, we will continue to assess the impacts, and then we will determine what the next steps should be.
On peut lire que la protection demandée pour la
We've
population.
read that the protection required for the population of Pipmuacan has its objective to avoid, in 10 years, a similar situation as we're seeing in Charlevoix. So how can one put forward the assumption that in 10 years from now, the situation might be similar to the one in Charlevoix? Whereas I'm told that there is a single reference point that was carried out in 2012 in Pipmoacan. I'm sorry for mispronouncing that. It's Pipmoacan. Sorry about that.
I'm trying to understand the question. I think you are referring to how much certainty do we have that the actions we're proposing will prevent the reduction in the population. And the answer to that question is, it is only when there is sufficient habitat for the animals to survive that we have a likelihood of protecting the population. So I cannot guarantee the outcome, but without habitat, the animals have no possibility of reversing the population decline.
Dans l'analyse économique, est-ce que vous tenez compte
in the economic analysis, are you taking into account the domino effect? Because there's been such a great impact on the forest sector recently, so that this the fact that there is less forestry available, it's a difference between making a profit and seeing losses and a complete closure of the entire sector. That is something that could happen. That is real.
So, yeah, I would respond by saying, like, in the analysis, we do look at the direct jobs and indirect jobs as well at the macro level, and we do acknowledge that over the last decade, there's been challenges facing the Quebec forest sector, and due to other external factors, lumber price volatility, tariffs, and that the employment has fallen over the last decade by nearly 7%.
Puis dans l'analyse, on peut lire que la main-d'œuvre.
In the analysis, it's indicated that it is an aging labor force. It's 27.7% in the forest sector compared to 23.3% in other sectors. And I find that it isn't clear if you deem that as a factor, one that is going to make the situation more serious.
I think it's just one of the pieces of context that we wanted to put in the analysis, that we're looking at this specific order, but we want to put it in the frame of the challenges that the Quebec forest sector is facing.
En tout cas, pour moi, là, c'est clairement.
Well, in my mind, this is an aggravating factor, clearly. So what I'm trying to understand is this. Have you looked at the fact that some of the most important economic activities, the sectors, are also the ones that are aging, that are being phased out in a given region?
Sorry, the translation just coming through.
Yeah, no problem.
We haven't looked at other sectors in this analysis. We were just focusing on the forestry and mining.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Taylor-Roy will end this hour. So you go ahead, Ms. Taylor-Roy, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And I just want to say I appreciate that, Mr. Winfield, you ended the last questions by saying that the boreal caribou have no chance if an emergency order is not put in. And so we may question what the probability of their success is of this program, but we know that they will not be here. They'll be extirpated if we do not do something. And, from 2002, these species have been on the species at risk list. There's so much work been done over the years. And as several witnesses said, these animals are the most studied of any in Canada. We know a lot about them. And so there seems to be this tension between short-term profitability and job retention, which, of course, jobs are very important. In fact, our government has created more jobs than any other government. But it's the role of government to look at the longer term, not just at short-term profit. And I'm wondering, you could put this in context in terms of these jobs in the forestry sector, when we have a Sustainable Jobs Act in place, when we know there has to be a transition, that these forests, the health of them are so linked to the health of the caribou, that are these jobs going to be there longer than, say, another 2 or 3 years if the caribou are extinct and these circumstances continue to grow, things like climate change, forest fires, and all these other things? Are we just looking at trying to a short-term solution as opposed to a long-term solution when we're simply focusing on saving the jobs and the type of jobs that are there today rather than looking at long-term employment for these communities, which are so important?
Thank you for the question. I don't feel we're well placed to speak to the future of the forestry industry in and of itself. I think what I would say is, to your point about the boreal caribou and their health being an indicator of the health of the forests, that is something I think that we need to be taking into account and paying attention to. The health of those forests, not only for the caribou, but also for the future existence of the forests themselves. I would add that in the process of the consultations, we have, of course, been hearing from union members about the importance of balancing the protection of the caribou with the health of the sector, and acknowledging that their desire is to have a sustainable forestry sector.
Very good.
I'll leave
Thank
it there.
you. And do you feel, I know that this request for the emergency order was put forward from several First Nations in Quebec, and they've been very concerned about the health of the boreal caribou. And as I said, we've known about this for a long time. Do you feel that or is there any indication that the lumber companies, the forestry companies, pulp and paper, have actually been taking action to address this issue in and of themselves? Because we hear a lot that, we don't need big government, we don't need government to intervene at all, that we just leave companies to make a profit and all will be well. And I'm wondering, what have the companies done to ensure that their forestry industry will have long-term sustainability and provide jobs for workers in the long term and not just the short term?
I think that's a question probably best placed for my colleagues at the Canadian Forest Service who are not here. I will, though, note that in the minister, during his remarks, he did speak to some of the innovations that he's seeing in the forest sector in Quebec and elsewhere. Again, I'll leave the question, though, in its entirety to colleagues from the forest sector who, I'm sorry, are not here today.
Okay, thank you. I think that's important because they've known about these issues for a long time. And I think at times these companies do innovate, but it's only when faced with a real challenge, a real, a hard line that they actually take the action that's needed to address some of these problems. So I think that, in terms of this balance between, on the one hand, protecting our biodiversity and our climate and our forests versus short-term profit and maximum extraction, that we need to have these companies play a role as well. The unions, the workers seem to be on board. They want to ensure there's a healthy forest, a long-term sustainable industry for them and their children, perhaps, to also participate in. But we seem to be missing the full commitment of some of these forestry companies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, this ends our second hour. I want to thank the officials for being here and answering all the members' questions. We'll take a little break while we bring we on board the next set of witnesses, and it shouldn't take very long. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
We are going to resume, and I would like to say that the sound tests have been conducted for our witnesses who are joining us remotely in Zoom. We are welcoming two witnesses, that is rather one group with a number of individuals. That is the Boisaco Group, Inc. So Boisaco, Inc., we have Joyce Dion, who is from the harvesting team as a worker, Joseph-Pierre Dufour, a stationary engineer, Valérie Dufour, coordinator, sales and transport. That is one group. And as an individual, we also have with us Mr. Jean-Pierre Jeté, forest engineer. We will begin with Mr. Jean-Pierre Jeté. You have 5 minutes. Chair, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the issue of the woodland caribou with you. I'm a forest engineer retired from the Ministry of Forests of Quebec, where I worked for 30 years. I remain active, however, particularly in working on boreal forest management issues. Over the past 15-20 years, I have witnessed the debates concerning the fate of the woodland caribou. Throughout this period, I've always felt that the vast majority of stakeholders were keen to strike a balance, and that nobody wanted to see a catastrophe for forest communities. In my mind, this is a precious asset to cultivate. This quest for balance certainly involves optimizing protection efforts. The contours of the areas to be protected have been redrawn 1,000 times, and measures with the least impact on industry have often been examined. However, to find a consensual solution, we also need to look at the other end of the spectrum. The current business model and its value chain must also be part of the equation. These are not immutable and must be allowed to evolve. Defending the status quo at all costs is not a position conducive to compromise. All the more, since an evolution of the business model could make room for the caribou while offering interesting economic prospects. We owe it to ourselves to explore this avenue. Several players in the forestry world are talking about the need for a just transition. I agree. But I would also add that a concrete and rigorous discussion on the subject is undeniably part of a consultation process. What we need to do now is to move beyond the stage of general ideas and down to drawing up a just transition plan. In my opinion, such a plan should have 3 components. First, short-term mitigation measures must be put in place to offset immediate impacts. Several options are possible. By way of example, let's mention the option of revising plant supply structures. That was done in the past already. As well, silvicultural programs requiring the workforce usually involved in harvesting are conceivable. In addition, other regional projects could provide employment for certain categories of workers. I'm thinking here of wind power projects. The second aspect, the most important, concerns industrial transition as such. The sawmill industry is already in a process of consolidation. In this context, there will be winners with more profitable plants, but there will also be losers, with villages seeing their mills close. This is when we need to consider the development of new niches based on a value-added approach or on the harvesting of wood that is currently available but underutilized by the industry. There are significant quantities of wood to be valorized. Wood chemistry could offer interesting options. And finally, the third component involves taking corrective action to ensure predictable supply for the next generation of industry. A number of problems are currently compromising the expected wood supply, caribou or not. The debate surrounding the order should lead to the creation of a working group tasked with preparing a transition plan. And to succeed, this group should call in independent experts and ensure transparency in its approach. It will also require financial support from both levels of government. It won't be easy, and the results are uncertain.
But I refuse to believe that this will be zero. If not, what is the other option? It takes a touch of naivety to think that the caribou controversy will slowly die out as the last individuals are put into enclosures and pens. Without a credible plan to protect the caribou, the conflict will continue. And eventually, it will become worse. One consequence of this will be to act as a deterrent to investors. Yet they are essential players in the modernization of a timber industry that we want to see robust and sustainable for the benefit of forest communities. Let's take advantage of the fact that everybody wants this future for the communities, and let's bring all of the ingredients into the discussion. That way, we'll be able to find a solution that truly brings people together. I think my main message is to say, yes, there are options, but that might be our only means forward. Thank you very much. So it's up to Boissaco. I don't know who is going to speak first. On behalf of Boissaco, of course, you can share your time. Mr. Dufour, Mr. Joseph Pierre Dufour, please go ahead. Hello, my name is Joseph Pierre Dufour. After 40 years of development, our current structure, which harvests renewable forest resources, now makes 100% use of the material. Although we're dependent on a single resource, its value is applied in a variety of economic sectors. If you're already familiar with the Sacré-Cœur complex, you'll know that in addition to lumber production at the Boissaco plant, it also includes factories such as Sacopan, which uses wood shavings to produce door panels, and Granulco, which uses sawdust to make pellets, and Ripco, which transforms shavings into horse bedding. To make sure nothing goes to waste, our thermal power stations and boiler rooms burn the bark for our heat-intensive processes, and finally send the ashes to local farmers. I think our complex is an exemplary model, supported by the local community and based on a vision of sustainable development. The emergency order as presented jeopardizes more than 600 direct jobs, hundreds of indirect jobs, entrepreneurs, businesses, and as many families who would be affected by the disappearance of this region's only economic engine. With a population of 5,000 spread over 4 municipalities, it's official that this would be a catastrophe for the North Shore and would also have negative repercussions for the Saguenay and the Charlevoix regions. Let's face it, we are not going to reinvent the economy of the upper North Shore overnight. We're not in a major center, but in a relatively isolated and remote region where interesting jobs in our respective trades are hundreds of kilometers away. What's more likely to happen, if the worst comes to worst, is that many families will leave for other regions because there won't really be any jobs here to support them. Thank you. Thank you very much. Does this conclude the presentation by Boissaco? Would anybody else like to speak? Ms. Dufour, I believe that you've raised your hand. Then Mr. Dufour and Joyce Dion. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Valérie Dufour, and I'm very lucky to be able to work for Boissaco. As well, I'm a municipal councillor for the Sacré-Cœur. Myself and my husband are working thanks to the Boissaco Group's forest operations. I appear before you today. It's for you to understand that ever since the announcement of a possible adoption of the order, our lives have literally been put on pause. For instance, this year my children asked me what we're going to do during the summer holiday. And I had to tell them that there won't be any vacation this year. Because if the order passes, mom and dad will be losing their jobs and they're going to have to move away from Sacré-Cœur. However, I did promise them that I'd do my very best to ensure that we can stay home in Sacré-Cœur. And I'm not the only family that is experiencing so much uncertainty and anguish. The closure of the Boissaco Group's plants would be catastrophic for Boissaco and its citizens. So whether this be for myself, my husband, my children, my family, my friends, my colleagues, and the citizens of my village, I'm asking you to review this order to find plausible solutions, and I remain hopeful that together we'll be able to find solutions that enable us to maintain our jobs and to continue making a living with dignity. And this is really a cry from the heart for all those moms and dads who, like me, promised their children that they would be able to work and stay home in Sacré-Cœur. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Dion. Mr. Dion, you have about a minute. Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Joyce Dion, a wood harvesting specialist at Boissaco. The Dion family has been harvesting for over 50 years, and even our children share our passion. I lead a team of 15 men who are as proud of their profession as I am. The announcement of this order is a catastrophe for us. It jeopardizes the families of forestry workers. Our harvesting and management work creates a renewable forest that we take care of, while respecting biodiversity and environmental standards. Forest management greatly reduces the risk of fire and allows the public to enjoy the area as a leisure activity. There's a way for everybody to benefit without the loss of thousands of direct and indirect jobs. I sincerely believe that with Boissaco's knowledge of the land and the government's demand, we can find solutions together to abolish this order. To better understand this sector, I'd like the members of your committee to come and visit us in our territory. That will give you a better idea, and that it'll enable you to make a more informed decision. 25 years ago, when I started in the forest in the same area, there were 40 harvesters and 3 sawmills. Today, we're down to less than 10 harvesters and 1 single sawmill in the area, and we're not in a position to use it. So where will this end? With an order like this, I've recently experienced stress, anxiety, and discouragement, which is upsetting everybody around me. I'd like you to think about the future of our young people in a forest who will also be compromised by this decree. Don't forget, we all depend on the forest. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Mr. Dion. We'll begin with Mr. Martel for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for having come to see us this evening. Well, I'd like to begin with Mr. Dufour. Mr. Dufour, it seems that the forest has a terrible reputation. People think they speak about the forest as though we were back in the 1960s. I think the situation has improved greatly since that time, and I'm convinced that you love the forest. So I'd like you to speak to me about the good sides of the benefits of the forest industry. Well, I work in processing more. So as I've explaining, in our complex, what we do is all based on sustainable development with primary and secondary processing. We use the raw material at 100%. Obviously, perhaps Mr. Dion could give you a better answer with respect to the actual forest. Yes, Mr. Dion. Mr. Dion, no. Mr. Dion? Well, for us in the forest, for 25 years now, everything has been improved. We conduct special cuts. We have all kinds of protection measures in place. We protect endangered species. We take care of all of this. It's no longer the way it used to be many, many years ago. So don't think that forest workers are those who destroy the forests and that just pick up cash and that they go home. Everybody believes that the forest is extremely important. It's very dear to our hearts. So, Mr. Dion, we're always hearing that the forestry sector, the companies, the workers, that this is passed down from generation to generation. And often it is children who continue working in the forestry sector. So in Sacré-Cœur, is that more or less the situation? Well, everybody in Sacré-Cœur works for Boissaco because they're all very proud of their plant, and it's something that we share. We're all very happy. The children are ready to continue doing the work that their parents did. They're very proud of it. Thank you. Ms. Dufour. Let's say if Mr. Guilbeault were to push forward his order, what would be the impact for you and your family? Well, it's obvious that we won't be able to stay in Sacré-Cœur. My husband and I both work in the forestry operations. If this order were unfortunately adopted, we know that the impact would be for Boissaco. No doubt this would lead to closure. So no longer any jobs for myself and my husband. We would have to leave Sacré-Cœur, and that's far from what we want. We've had the privilege of being able to do our jobs in large urban centers, but losing the forest and losing our community is something else. And we're at Sacré-Cœur. We've chosen to be there. We decided to work there. Ms. Dufour, how much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? 2.5 minutes. Ms. Dufour. Well, it was very touching when the mayor stated that if the order were to be imposed, there's a risk that the community might disappear at the end of the day. Yes, please go ahead. Well, that's true. The village's survival is at stake. And the Boissaco Group isn't just a company that hires people and that creates jobs. They're a partnership for our municipality. When we organize events and when we buy goods, Boissaco is always backing us. We can always count on the Boissaco Group. So obviously, this is an extremely valuable help to us. So just consider that this order might be imposed. What do you see in the future? Right now, are you thinking about what you're going to do with your assets, with your house? Where are you going to move to? Have you thought about this with your husband? Yes, we had to think about it. Well, from the bottom of our hearts, we hope it doesn't happen. But it's very stressful for us. If it were to happen, and if the Boissaco Group had to close shop, I'd have to relocate with my family. I'd have to sell my house. I'd have to be able to buy another one. And everybody knows that the Sacré-Cœur village might disappear. And this is a worry. We won't be able to sell our house. What am I going to do with my 3 young children? And to move them, this is very stressful. It's a terrible time for us. Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses who have agreed to appear before the committee tonight. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to all of the workers of the forest sector. Wood, pulp and paper are sustainable products, especially compared to alternatives like plastics. So, also, I know that you make efforts to plant efforts and to reforest areas. I'd like to thank you for that contribution to the Canadian economy.
For what it's worth, you seem stressed, and I just want to express my sympathy with you, because this seems like a very emotional and stressful time for your families, and you're working hard to provide for your families and contribute to the Canadian economy, and I want to acknowledge that. My question is for Monsieur Jeté, about the future of forestry in Canada and our ability and, frankly, obligation to ensure there is one. We have to ensure that there is a future economy of forestry in Canada because we rely on it. We rely on the products. We rely on the contributions to the economy. We rely on work as workers. We rely on the money they make to provide for their families. But me, from my perspective, we built a deck this summer out of wood. And, that wood was harvested in Canada. And we need to ensure that we have a sustainable lumber, pulp, and paper economy in Canada. And that includes making sure that our commitments for biodiversity are also respected. So the term balance has come up a few times in this committee. We've had workers, industry representatives, scientists come express varying degrees of urgency with respect to the population of caribou and also for the industry itself. From your position, Monsieur Jeté, where do we find a balance for Canadian workers, for the Canadian economy, and for the future of the forestry industry, which needs to protect the whole forest, not just the woods?
Je pense que une bonne partie de la solution réside.
I think that a large part of the solution lies in the plants in the industry. They say that the industry has to renew itself for various reasons. Apart from caribou, what caribou does that it brings us brutally close to the deadline that we have to make changes. So let's take the opportunity to make those changes and to speed up those changes in such a way as to find a way through that will enable us both to protect the caribou and especially to ensure a future for that industry. And this change would rely on a modernization of the lumber sector. Modernization by investing more in high-value products and also by trying to derive value out of large quantities of wood that right now in Quebec is not being used for value because it doesn't fulfill the current structure of the industry. And that's an important aspect. Just to give you an example, in 2020, the lumber production strategy of the Quebec government identified that there was 11 million cubic meters of hardwood per year that is not being used by the industry. I mean, that's across Quebec as a whole, but as part of the lumber production strategy for Quebec, there was already this desire to have the value chain adapted in such a way as to derive more value out of that wood. Isn't there a potential to find something in order to reassure people? Because we hear this and it's important, the anguish, but can't we reassure them not by defending the status quo, but by looking toward the future that I hope would be sustainable? Thank you for your answer.
A little more than a minute. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've also heard on this committee from First Nations leaders who, over 10 years ago, had to take the extraordinary steps to stop hunting caribou, a practice that they've relied on since time immemorial, and but recognizing the decline in populations, that extraordinary step. People living in Quebec are employed in the pulp, paper, and lumber industries. So it kind of, presents a little bit of another challenge with respect to the term balance. That, if we want to see caribou in 50 years and a forestry sector in 50 years, then change is necessary. Some modifications to the current status quo are necessary. The officials who just left us said that the status quo will result in a further declination of the caribou populations. I'd like to ask a question to,
There's really no time for a question.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I went on so long.
Okay, thank you. Madame Posey.
Jose. So I'll leave the floor to my colleague Marilyn. Thank you, Chair. And thank you for being here, Mr. Jeté. I would also like to thank Ms. Dufour and Mr. Dufour and Mr. Dion. As you are aware, I understand you. I'm from the North Shore, and I would like to put a personal side in it. Ms. Dufour really moved me. I experienced a similar, slightly different moment when she talked about having to leave her home and her region. The father of my two oldest children worked at Zacopan, and then at Cougar in Longrive, you know where it is, in the upper North Shore. and the sawmill closed, so we moved to Baie-Comeau. After that, with all the impacts that it can have on our lives and our families and even the community, and of course I'm talking about myself because I experienced that really in my gut, but also it wasn't exactly the same thing in Longue-Rive as in the past. So we have a lot of communities that rely on one industry, and I am hearing solutions, and I don't like to hear naive comments. We can't move 4 or 5 kilometers down the road and work for wind turbines when we were always in a forestry community near Saguenay or Port-Cartier. It's not the same as Sacré-Cœur. This is one thing. And I asked Mr. Guilbeault to go and visit even before Ms. Bouillon was mayor, of course, with all the team of Bois-Sacco, because to me, there are a number of things at issue, and I'm sure that in your case, the issue of social peace and everything we say about our families, because a lot is said about the First Nations, but at the same time, are we talking to all the First Nations? Are we also talking about their knowledge? I went out on the land with them, and as regards caribou, they're headed east to see exactly where they live. It's not necessarily in Picmogan. They won't stay there either. It's not the only activity in the forestry industry. There's also leisure activities and other things. But to me also, I was defeated yesterday when I read an article that said in Ontario, the government had an agreement with the Ford government for the industry, which it's funny, it seems like a double standard. The government isn't making any effort as compared to the Quebec government. As you saw, Ms. Blanchette-Vézina, Ms. Catherine Jourdain, you saw Ms. Laforêt and Mr. Montigny. They went to visit you as my team did in order to say, no, Quebec is here and Quebec is going to help you. And then basically what we're doing with Ontario, they're not asking them to do the same thing. That I find quite surprising. The government should take that into account. And what really reaches me is that I'd like to hear you on this to show how much Sacré-Cœur stands as a model, because we have to use all the trees, all the species, all the parts of the tree, but Bois-Sacco already does that. Mr. Dufour, at the beginning, he talked about that. Sacapin and Ripco are mentioned. Granulico is mentioned. They use everything. There's nothing left that's not being used. And in addition to that, it's one of the targets, one of the goals, one of the witnesses talked about it being a sustainable business. And there are biases here that they say it's not sustainable, but that we need to go farther. But you're ahead of most other businesses. And what we're going to do is say, with a super model like that in Quebec, I would go as far as to saying within Canada, and they're going to close the village, close down the town. That's unacceptable. So thank you for being here to raise questions about this order. We want solutions, and quickly. A lot is being said about caribou and quick solutions. I'd like to hear you on this. You talked about anguish, Ms. Dufour, but the order. In the questions, it says, what will be the impact when there is an order? Well, the order is already having its impact. It's already destroying the industry there and destroying villages. And of course, we'll be with you. Sacré-Cœur will not close down, but I'd like to hear you on that, on everything I said. And you can finish it off because there are other realities and certain biases we hear or stereotypes that we hear here in the committee. So Ms. Dufour, Mr. Dufour, Mr. Dion, please take time. A minute and a half left. If you can share the minute and a half, I'll step in to answer a little bit overall. Bois-Sacco, what they take to heart is development and the development of all its plants or sawmills, because over the years, they've just been doing that. They've been developing. Now we've been able to get 100% of the tree being used and benefit from all sorts without wasting them. So as you know, not all sawmills are able to succeed in doing that either. So it's along those lines that is important. And the families, well, of course, when they announced that some people are really at anguish right now, it mustn't take a year or two to find out what's going to happen either. You know, it's really important. I don't know if Ms. Dufour, if you'd like to pick up from there. I have the impression here that they want to punish a model of the industry. we're like a model and not punished, but we're the ones who are being hit by it because we stand as a model for the industry. You're being taken hostage. Indeed, the local communities, we have the impression that we're being taken hostage by this order. Why not have an order that, we understand that they want to protect the species, but such a drastic protection plan? Okay, we'll break off there to hear Mr. Boulouris. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for being here, even virtually with us, for this important study for many people, and myself too. I must say that it really moves me to hear you tell your stories and your reality, which I'm not that familiar with in contrast to others, but that I have been hearing a lot about in recent weeks. And these are very delicate issues, and I can understand that it causes a lot of worry and anguish. And we're going to try to find the right approach to do collectively what we need to do as regards environmental protection, biodiversity, and also regional development and maintaining jobs. Mr. Jeté, you said a couple of big words, fair transition. These are words which each of them, people understand that the way they want to for that concept. I'm very proud of the work we've accomplished, especially with Charlie Angus, for a bill on sustainable jobs where workers have their place at the table and the unions too. And you started talking about what it could look like with your 3 points for the beginning of a fair transition and changes in the industry as well. But the first thing you said is mitigation measures. I'd like to get a better idea what you're talking about there, and then I have more questions after. Yes, well, the fair transition, the word fair, because industrial transition is occurring, but we're not sure it will be fair. So it is important to be concerned about the outcome of workers, categories of workers that can be impacted by changes. And I believe that for a certain category of workers, I think particularly in the forestry sector, there are a lot of options available to ensure that those people can keep working in their field and doing things. I talked about silviculture programs where we can use those people. I'm also thinking, when I gave you the example of wind turbines, I was thinking about the mega wind farms that is being considered, and building roads and things like that. So there are things like that. And also, as things advance, the other transition, in other words, consolidation of sawmill operations that we're seeing, this is going to make available certain volumes. And the decision, to come back to the word fair, the decision is not just a question of business, but it's also a social matter. How can we ensure that based on changes that we're seeing now, how can we make sure that we help Sacré-Cœur? How can we send Eugène-Milot is a town in Lac-Saint-Jean. That's where they are. There's a plant that's announced its closing. So it's not just to have a transition plan and say in Canada, we're going to go into bioproducts. No, what do we do in the Saint-Eugène-de-Milot? Based on the wood that we can find there, that is not necessarily the fir and pine to make, or spruce and pine to make 2x4s. We have the expertise and the technology and chemists who are familiar with those things. Can we pull that together and say, oh, we have a social problem in Saint-Eugène-de-Milot, and that's a transition plan, a fair transition plan. It's a transition that is reasoned based on the interests of the communities and the workers. I was surprised by the figure you mentioned in a report of the Quebec government on 11 million cubic meters of wood not being per year. Okay. That's underused or not used. You also talked about a lot of value derivation in that transition. Do you have any approaches to suggest on that underused or unused wood? Right now, there are 4 sources. I gave you the example of the hardwood, and for all sorts of reasons, that wood is not up to quality based on the current structure of the market, but that doesn't mean that biochemistry cannot find applications for it. in new products, and there are already cases. I'm not an expert on it, but I know that there are cases where that is beginning, and we have to really go into it. Burned wood, 900,000 hectares of wood burned, and the capacity for the sawmill industry to go and get that wood is very low, and after a year, the wood is no good anymore. But there are still 900,000 odd hectares of wood. What can be done with it? In addition, there will be more with climate change. So isn't there a possibility to open up there on the North Shore in the industry? They're less interested in, fur. There's fur that they leave behind because it doesn't fulfill the requirements for the sawmill, but they can be used for something else, perhaps. And the last one is construction waste. Right now, it goes into landfill sites, and methane is produced by it, which is bad for greenhouse gases. Can we consider using a circular economy in that case and recuperate that material to do something else with it? Bioproducts, energy, things like that. I leave it to the experts to deal with it, but you can see that there are possibilities. And of course, we have to put together a project to roll up our sleeves and take charge of things, because we have to act in consistency with a message, and we have to give a message of hope. But we have the technology to do so. Thank you. So now we move into the second and last round, and it's Mr. Martel. The second and last round. Aren't there three? No, there are not 3 rounds. There are 2 rounds, a 6-minute one and a 5-minute one.
Mr. Martel is going to lead off the 5-minute round. No.
But after that, no more? Okay, that's what I wanted to know. That's where we're at with the confusion. Okay. Thank you, Chair. I just want to ask Valérie, were you visited by the minister? Because Sacré-Cœur, as I'm hearing it, the village could close down with that order. Did the minister visit you? Are you talking about Minister Guilbeault, I imagine? Yes, Minister Guilbeault. It's his order. No, we did not have a visit from Mr. Guilbeault. Would you have liked to hear from him as a human being? Do you find that it is in fact quite tragic if the community might close? How would you find that? Would you like him to at least go and see you and talk things over with you? Indeed, we would really appreciate that he come to meet us and see what our reality is, because sure, this evening I shared with you a little bit what my family and I are experiencing, but I'm talking on behalf of all families in Sacré-Cœur. I'm not the only family experiencing that. We have the impression that he made an order, yes, with what knowledge he has, but the human side, the side of what we are living through, what our children are living through, the citizens in Sacré-Cœur are living through, was not taken into account. We work, we take charge of things, we earn our living with dignity, and we feel like we're being brushed aside without being consulted, and our reality was ignored. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Valérie. Thank you. Chair, I would like to present a motion. Before you do that, I'd like to clarify something so I better understand your question. So, to better understand your question,
I only heard him, so I'm sorry. Yeah, anyway, I'm sorry, that's who I heard first. But anyway, I just want to clarify something. Mr. Martel, the second round includes 2 chances for the Conservatives to speak. You, and then I have you again. So maybe that's what you thought about a 3rd round, but it's not a 3rd round. It's the 2nd round, but you're on twice. C'est bon?
Is that okay? So that means that we have another one. What is it? There are 6 opportunities in the 2nd round. There are 6 chances to speak, 2 for the Liberals, 2 for the Conservatives. Go ahead with your motion. Okay, so of course, following the testimony that I've heard throughout the last meetings. I would like to dedicate the following motion to the workers present here. So the motion, I'll read it as follows. Given that the proposed order by the Minister of the Environment for the province of Quebec, first of all, will suppress at least 1,400 jobs according to the Environment Analysis and Climate Change Canada analysis, will result in the disappearance of certain Quebec communities such as Sacré-Cœur, the mayor of which said that the town would become a ghost town or nearly and make housing more expensive, whereas the province of Quebec is already in a housing crisis caused by that government, the Liberal government, being a direct attack on Quebec's jurisdiction. According to the committee, expresses to the House its opposition to the emergency order of the Minister of the Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, and requests the government urgently to cancel its plan to impose that order in Quebec. That's your motion. It's in French and English. Fine, so Mr. Van Couverden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to Monsieur Martel for the motion. We would like some time to review it, and out of respect for the witnesses who have joined us here today and the time of day, which is quite late, I would ask that we quickly adjourn debate on this motion and move on and complete the meeting so that we can hear from our important witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll vote.
We'd like time to read the motion.
Official motion?
Well, let's just see. I think I sense that a nuance there. So he wants to adjourn debate. He wants to basically adjourn debate on this. Yeah. So if we side with Mr. Van Couverden, wait, the motion. Yes, the vote. Okay, go. Well, no, we have to. If the majority is with Mr. Van Couverden, that's it. We move on. Okay, got it. Okay, that's what I want to make sure.
So what is the actual motion? What is he proposing?
He's proposing to shut this down.
Shut down the motion that.
Well, it's adjourn debate on the motion.
It's a dilatory motion, Chair.
Yeah, that's right. We're not debating it. He's asking a clarification. So yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
So move to adjourn debate on the motion. Mr. Ali.
In favor.
Madame Chatel. Mr. Longfield.
In favor.
Ms. Taylor-Roy. Oh, you're on mute, I believe.
In favor.
Mr. Van Couverden.
Favor.
Mr. Cram.
Opposed.
Mr. Leslie.
Opposed.
Mr. Mazur.
Opposed.
Monsieur Martel. Madame Posé.
Oui.
Et Monsieur Boudres.
En faveur.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Okay, so we go now to Mr. Longfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses, and I apologize for the interruption of our meeting. I'm very interested in the sustainability of the lumber and forestry industry. I've worked in that industry myself, and out of Winnipeg, but also out of various plants in Ontario and up in Saguenay. I've seen what happened to the paper industry when newspapers stopped being read and China took on cheap paper, and the paper industry went to a better grade of paper to try and keep value in Canada. We definitely need to keep a healthy forestry industry in Canada. Mr. Dion, you mentioned the sustainability efforts, and since the 70s, it's a different industry. The sustainability of the forestry industry is an example for all industries. And you mentioned the commitment there. I'm not trying to trap you into a commitment, but I think it's important to set that baseline that we need to work together for a sustainable industry. You mentioned animals and caribou come into this. Could you maybe put some context to sustainability for us as a committee as we discuss this. Mr. Dion.
Oui, ben la durabilité, tu sais, avec les années, tout s'améliore. Tu sais, tantôt, monsieur, il parlait de du bois feuillu, tu sais. Puis nous autres, chez Boissaco...
Je m'excuse, attention, I don't have translation. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Est-ce que ça va traduire, oui?
No. My French isn't as good as Mr. Vancouverton, unfortunately. I grew up in Manitoba, and when I was in Abitibi, they said, "Did you learn your French in Manitoba?" I said, "Yeah, I did." It wasn't good French. Translators?
Okay, can I answer?
Yes, please.
Is it translated?
Very good, very good. Thank you. Thank you, translators.
Okay, it's working now. Continue along, Mr. Dion. Okay, as regards sustainability, in previous years, if you want, with regard to wood, we were concerned about it. We didn't have the engineering we have nowadays. And still, as evidence of what we did with Boissaco, it's that for hardwood, we didn't want to waste it, because in Boissaco we had also a plant dealing with aspen. And when we got aspen, there is also birch in there, and we wanted to find some way not to waste it. So since this year, we've been doing wood granules with birch wood. So anything can be done. We always try to be ahead of the curve.
That's great. And I think, if I can say so, you're ahead of Ontario, because Ontario still wastes a lot in the production, and some mills could be financially viable if they found value in the chips on the ground and found value in doing what you're doing to pivot. The issue we're dealing with is a legal requirement we have as a federal government, and we're trying to get the province of Quebec to the table because we can't operate without them in this agreement. And we're not getting return phone calls. Could you help to maybe ask or say how important it is for the province of Quebec to be involved? We have Indigenous communities, we have businesses, we just don't have the province at the table. Mr. Dion?
Well, I cannot speak for the province of Quebec, but what I can say is that there is a lot of work being done over recent years, and they're also concerned about the woodland caribou. I'm not sure where the federal government and Quebec stand and how it got lost, but the Quebec government has the knowledge to find some grounds for agreement on this. I don't know. I cannot speak for them. I don't want to.
I wish I could get an insight, and I agree. And the herds are different in British Columbia. They're different in Ontario. Quebec has its own particular issues that we've got lots of testimony on. So it's just really important that we can, first of all, understand we want you to succeed as a federal government. We need a strong forestry sector. The sector is doing remarkable jobs on conservation, but we need to also protect biodiversity of the animals in the forest. And for that, we need to have the province at the table. So I'll turn my time back unless there's any other comments from anybody else. Mr. Jeté? Mr. Dufour?
Well, actually, I would just like to say that I think the Quebec government already did not have its arms crossed regarding protecting caribou. Maybe it's too soon to assess the effectiveness of the measures that they had already brought in.
Right, and we think that they are the partner. On this particular agreement, we just need to get them to the table with all the rest of us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey. So I'll yield my time to my colleague, Marilyn. Thank you, Chair. I would like to return to Mr. Dion, who perhaps didn't finish 2.5 minutes precisely. Hence, I talked a lot earlier. So in short, I would like to give them a chance to speak. If you have anything to say to Mr. Guilbeault regarding what needs to be done what would you tell him? And of course, I will once again invite him to come to our area and see what's going on there if you would like to speak to him. Thank you. Well, actually, I would say that clearly the threat of an emergency order to protect caribou that the Canadian government floated could force the Quebec government to bring in additional measures. But is it reasonable to take hostage the entire population? We are the real victims that could suffer the consequences of an argument between, well, a squabble between two levels of government, it seems. Well, what I ask Minister Guilbeault to do is to, he started up his order and causing terror, and terror is not going to solve anything in a conflict. Instead of focusing on solving a conflict, they're afraid, so they're focused on their fear. So try to find some area of agreement without saying everything is going to close down, and to show that there's something else other than shutting down Sacré-Cœur in order to ensure survival of caribou. I'm sure there are other options. That's what I wanted to say. Yes, and it causes chaos among the population. We feel the tension in the communities. We've never experienced that here in our sector, in the upper North Shore. It's incredible. So perhaps Ms. Dufour to finish off, and at the same time perhaps tell me what you think about the double standard with Ontario. Well, for my part, anyway, I find Wasako, here we're working hard. The gentleman talked about harvesting burned wood, and yes, there is burned wood being collected with the Quebec government. There are special plans for that harvesting. Wasako has participated in plans of that nature. We have taken charge of things, the hardwoods. We do part of the harvest with our company, Wasako Group and Wasako Valley Bois. We have the impression that every worker who works is not just a job. We've really taken charge as a society. We are stakeholders in that business, and we have the impression that nobody is listening to us and our reality is not being taken into account. Fine. Now, Mr. Boulris. Thank you very much, Chair. I find it very interesting what we're hearing today in a very complex file. And I'm sorry that the anguish for communities like Sacré-Cœur that you're experiencing now, it's going to be quite dreadful. And we have to deal with a number of different factors, including the federal government's obligation on endangered species. We cannot just ignore it and say we won't do anything. We have to try to, they're trying to do everything all at once, and that's what's hard on our side of the fence. Speaking of fences, Mr. Winfield of the Canadian Wildlife Service talked about pens, which are a temporary measure to protect the three herds that are really threatened. And he said something that really struck me. He said, we cannot release them completely into nature. They have nowhere to go. And so, isn't there something there? Other witnesses talked about that before. In the territory development and in protection of the habitat, or the rearrangement of the habitat, so that eventually those animals can have a place to go to. Isn't there some opportunity for creating jobs too, Mr. Jeté? Are you talking about reforestation? Yes, reforestation, that's it. Well, in general, apart from certain exceptions in the case of forest fires, where forest fires cause problems of regeneration, normally the forest regenerates itself quite well. The problem is the time that it takes. It takes time, takes a lot of time. That is why if we don't reduce the pressure of the cutting on the caribou habitat, then there's going to be no place for them to go in between, in the meantime. So, sure, we can do planting. It's already being done, but it's not the same category of worker. It's not a solution to me. I'm not against the idea, but it's just that in a context of a transition plan, a fair transition plan, it's not the best approach. You have to go by categories of workers that you're dealing with. There may be other options, though, for mitigation in the medium term. Let's take, for example, I'm sorry, Mr. Jeté, I have to break you off there because it's 2.5 minutes. And now it's Mr. Martel. 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would like to know, I don't know, Mr. Dufour or Valérie or Mr. Dion, this passion of working in the forestry sector, who does that come from? Is it from your parents? Why are you so attached to that sector? Well, in my case, I've worked in other sectors. I've worked in other regions, in large cities. I left for a few years and I was attached to my region. I'm from here, I'm from Bergeron, so I came back to my natural habitat. Any others that would like to add something? Well, for my part, Boissaco, you know, my grandfather was part of Samako and my father was too. So it was passed down. I went elsewhere to see, but the love of the forest came back to me quickly. The love of our town. You have to live in a town in order to understand what it is from Monday to Friday. A person who lives next door, that's your colleague. And then on Saturday, they're a friend. And the forest is part of who we are. We spend a week in the forest, and then to relax on the weekend, we go back to go fishing or in ATVs. That's part of it. So I'll turn on the rest of my questions to my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Martel, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So the witnesses, obviously, I am not from Quebec, but when I ran for politics last year, the main thing that I ran on was protecting our rural way of life. And I feel an incredible kinship with our witnesses today as they are defending their own way of life and seemingly having a Ottawa knows best government running roughshod not only over their livelihoods but over their entire community. And I appreciate your very passionate and personal testimony today. And I noticed during the conversation between with Minister Guilbeault here a couple of hours ago, in response to MP Chatel, he said, "When the workers come here to committee, Conservatives ignore what they say." We are not ignoring you. We are hearing you. My colleague, Mr. Martel, has been doing a fantastic job of defending the rights of not only his riding, but the important work that the forestry sector and workers do across Quebec and in turn across all of Canada. And during his conversation with the mayor of Sacré-Cœur, he said, he asked her what would happen, and she suggested that the region would become a ghost town if this order was enacted. And Minister Guilbeault replied today during conversation that it's curious because that's not the message that the workers gave me when I met with them. So to close out this meeting, I would like to have Mr. Dufour, Ms. Dufour, Mr. Dion each give their assessment as to whether or not what the view of the workers is. Are they terrified that their livelihoods and their communities are about to be ruined, or are they in fact okay with this Ottawa imposition and the impact it's going to have on your livelihoods? I'll start with Mr. Dion.
Well, if I can give an example, it makes me think about so Cavillon in 2000. It could happen in this place too. Some workers, you know, they're terrified. We hear what they say. We listen to them. We're with them. We experience the reality. We live with them all the time, but they're so passionate about the forest that they go and stay there and they support us right through to the end. So all the workers in Boissaco will not give up, of course. They're ready. So that's their life. So everyone experiences that and continues their choice while respecting everyone in that. Thank you.
Ms. DeFore? Oh, there you go.
Pas de problème.
No problem. So as I said at the beginning of the session, well, listen, people in Sacré-Cœur are passionate people. They are people who, that's our habitat. Sacré-Cœur is our living area, it's our forest, it's part of who we are. And sure, we are experiencing anguish. We can see that if the order goes through, we'll have to exile ourselves, and that's not what we want to do. So we love the forest, we love our town, we want to stay home. Thank you. To wind up this 3-hour meeting, Ms. Châtel, thank you very much. Chair, thank you to our witnesses. And listen, what you're telling us today, I hear this in my area. I have rural communities that you're perhaps aware with in north of Outaouais in the Gatineau Valley. There's Maniwaki, we have the Louisiana Company and the Resolute Company. So the anguish that you're experiencing has been experienced by a number of families just like you, affected by it because access to the fiber is a big issue in the forestry sector. And so the distress call that we've been hearing during this committee meeting about workers and also from forestry companies is that we have to work together. Ms. Dufour, I can see you. You're asking, your distress call is for the levels of government and to the industries and to the workers. Well, let's work together because there are solutions and there are solutions. So when Minister Guilbeault said earlier, and myself, I saw him in the committee, wasn't listening to what the workers and their distress call is, that they don't want to work together. They want to create a division between us.
What I'm hearing from our riding and from you is to sit down together and find solutions. During the testimonies, we've, and we've confirmed also with the minister, is that somebody important is missing at the table. We have to save both the environment and the economy, and it's possible. If we work together, we can innovate and we can find solutions. But the province of Quebec is not at the table. And, that's my heartfelt cry, if you will. We absolutely have to ask the province to join in the efforts to sit down with the federal government and find solutions. For Sacré-Cœur, for Bois-Sacco, and for the survival of the forestry industry. You have 3 children, and there are other families, and we want work for our families. We don't want our children to have to leave the region. We want them to be able to work in forestry as well. So, Ms. Dufour, could you tell us the hope that you have that governments and that political parties work together to find a solution for you that works for you? I think Bois-Sacco and the village of Sacré-Cœur is the best example that you can find. Everybody works together. Those that work in harvesting, there are people who work at the plant, there's people in administration. So all of us were able to find solutions to use all of the tree. Bois-Sacco helps Sacré-Cœur to redistribute. So, maybe it's on a small scale. It's not at the government scale. But if a company like Bois-Sacco with a village like Sacré-Cœur have been able in 40 years to do what they've done, I'd like everybody to be able to see that, what Sacré-Cœur is about and what's Bois-Sacco and the importance that Bois-Sacco has for our village, the pride that every employee has to work. I'd like every official or a politician to be able to see that. And so we can come to a good solution. Listen, you said something very important, and I think this is a lesson both for the Conservatives, but also for the government of Quebec. Working together like your community does to find solutions that are innovative. When we work together, we can find solutions. There are solutions to be found. Now, you know, you're dealing with the caribou issue, but the forest issue is everywhere. So in your region, it's caribou. In another region, it's something else. And that's what you were saying, Mr. Jeté. We have to give hope, but we have to work together to rethink the forest in a sustainable way, and so that the children in the Aboriginal communities, the children of Miss Dufour, can work in that industry as well. So very briefly, sorry, your time is out. Sorry, Mr. Jeté. Listen, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for spending some time with us here and sharing their views with us today and their life experiences, their lived experiences. So that's where we have to end. I wish everyone a good evening. Yes?
Next steps here, we go into the study.
We're going to discuss that on Monday. We have about a half an hour of future business. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Alors, bonne soirée à tous et à toutes.
All right, have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.